Hey guys, tonight we wander together down the ghostly avenues of the ancient Roman world, sliding softly into an atmosphere where cracked marble and half-buried stones seem to breathe in the moonlight. You tread on uneven cobblestones, the cool night pressing against your skin, as if the air itself remembers every sandal that once struck these roads. Fires flicker far away in your imagination, smoke rising into a black sky speckled with stars, the way it might have looked when centurions still marched beneath banners of gold and crimson. The world seems still now, but you can almost hear echoes, the clang of armour, the hiss of hot iron, and the chatter of merchants haggling over amphorae of olive oil. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, I'd love for you to share your location and local time in the comments, just to remind us all how far these whispers of history travel tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin along a Roman road at dusk, the last light of day soaking into stone that has endured more centuries than you can comprehend. You run your fingers across grooves carved by wagon wheels, channels deep enough to trip a careless step. These roads, built with layers of gravel, sand, and heavy paving stones, once stretched like veins across the empire. Some historians estimate more than 250,000 miles of connected pathways. Imagine that, an ancient Uber system, except instead of surge pricing, you worried about bandits, taxes, or maybe a wild boar crossing your path. The fact is, Roman roads weren't just impressive for their engineering, they symbolized control. Soldiers could march quickly from Gaul to Germania, tax collectors could reach far-flung provinces, and gossip traveled almost as efficiently as rumors on modern social media. You can picture an exhausted traveller at a roadside inn, sipping watered wine and muttering about politics in the capital, because even back then, complaining was a universal pastime. But now, as you walk in the hush of medieval shadow, the road lies broken, grass pushing through cracks, no carts rolling by. Some scholars argue that after the empire fractured, local leaders simply stopped maintaining these arteries, their wealth and manpower redirected into personal castles rather than public works. Without constant repair, roads crumbled, rivers overflowed, and bridges collapsed. Villages that once thrived along these trade lines withered like leaves in late autumn. Here's a quirky tidbit to amuse you. In certain stretches of Europe, people still whisper that Roman roads were built by giants. It sounds absurd until you imagine a medieval peasant standing barefoot in the mud, staring at an endless ribbon of stone stretching to the horizon, wide enough for 4 chariots to ride side by side. To someone who had never seen a proper street, it must have looked like something only titans could craft. Yet historians still argue whether the neglect of roads truly killed Roman cities, or if it was the cities collapsing that made the roads irrelevant. It's a chicken and egg puzzle. Without commerce, why maintain them? But without roads, how does commerce survive? You stand there, balancing on that thought like a tightrope walker, the silence of the ruined highway pressing in. You let yourself drift deeper into the picture. It's night now, the sky full of a pale silver moon. The stones underfoot are cool, and weeds brush your ankles. You pass a half-broken milestone, its Latin inscription so worn that only a fragment, Imp Cs, remains visible. Somewhere out there, centuries ago, a road crew carved that with pride, never imagining you'd be squinting at it in the dark. Your ears pick up faint illusions, hoofbeats that aren't really there, the rattling wheels of ghost carts, perhaps even the bark of a long-dead dog running alongside a merchant's caravan. The mind is generous when the night is quiet. As you stroll, your thoughts flicker to the greater truth. Roads represented Rome's unity, and their decay mirrored its unravelling. when armies no longer marched with imperial discipline, when officials no longer demanded tolls, when engineers stopped showing up with gravel and mortar, the empire's nervous system went numb. Think of it like a massive cell phone network shutting down. Suddenly no one can call, text, or coordinate. Local communities fended for themselves, and grand cities became islands in a sea of silence. A light joke slips in here. At least those neglected Roman roads gave medieval travellers the original version of off-roading. Not with jeeps, of course, unless you count a goat-drawn cart with one squeaky wheel as high adventure. You continue, your pace slow, deliberately heavy, as if each step anchors you in the continuity of time. Occasionally you notice how straight the path runs. Romans loved straight lines. They sliced through hills and swamps with stubborn determination. But here and there, nature wins, the road bends, water has eaten away the edges, and entire slabs have tilted like fallen dominoes. You crouch to touch moss clinging to the gaps, damp and fragrant. Another fact drifts in. Some Roman roads are still in use today, repaved and hidden beneath asphalt. You may have driven over one without realizing. That momentary thought makes you grin. It's like time traveling in your Honda Civic. You picture a medieval traveler, centuries after Rome's fall, stumbling along this same stretch at night, carrying a bundle of firewood, muttering prayers against bandits. To him the road was both blessing and curse. Easier to follow than a forest trail, but haunted by memories of power that no longer protected him. The tension lingers. Did the abandonment of these roads mark the empire's death, or simply its fading heartbeat? Scholars still debate, and perhaps always will. You shrug, deciding it doesn't matter for now. What matters is the hush, the cooling stone beneath your soles, the way the night sky arches above you like a vast marble dome. One final playful thought before you rest. Imagine if Romans had invented GPS. In 2 miles, turn left at the crumbling aqueduct. If you've reached the barbarian camp, you've gone too far. You chuckle softly to yourself, the sound lost in the breeze. You walk on, letting your breath slow, lulled by the rhythm of stone underfoot. Each step is lighter now, as if you too might vanish with the road, slipping into memory along with the empire that built it. You leave the road behind, its lines stretching off into the night like a memory that refuses to fade, and you drift into the heart of a city that once buzzed with more voices than you could count. The Roman Forum lies before you, once the stage where senators schemed, merchants haggled, and philosophers lectured. But now the silence is almost theatrical. Broken columns jut like ribs out of the earth, weeds snake through the paving stones, and the faint hoot of an owl replaces the clamour of 1,000 conversations. You pause, listening. In your mind's ear, the forum springs back to life. A senator in a toga raises his hand. The crowd murmurs approval or jeers, and a pair of children dash between market stalls, giggling while their mother scolds them. Someone hawks dates, someone else argues about olive prices, and a philosopher drones on about stoic virtues, though you suspect even then half the audience was already nodding off. It's like a giant ancient food court mixed with a political rally, except with fewer fast food chains and more stray dogs sniffing amphorae. But now it is silence you taste, not roasted chestnuts. The air is cooler, tinged with dust, and only moonlight bothers to attend the meeting. The once vital spaces have become eerie shells, as if the city itself took a vow of silence centuries ago. A mainstream historical fact helps anchor your imagination. In Rome's prime, every city had its own forum. These weren't optional add-ons, they were the civic heart. Markets, trials, religious festivals, even casual gossip all centered here. Remove the forum and you remove the pulse. When these squares fell quiet, it wasn't just stone collapsing, it was civic life evaporating. The quirky tidbit comes next. Archaeologists once found a bronze sundial in a provincial forum that had been borrowed from another town. Apparently, ancient time theft was a thieves. Imagine stealing an entire clock just to spice up your own marketplace. You can't exactly slip that into your pocket. Historians still argue whether the silence of the forums was a symptom or a cause of urban decline. Did markets dry up because trade routes broke? Or did empty forums accelerate the collapse by making cities feel lifeless and unsafe? You lean against a toppled column, considering it like a riddle with no answer. Either way, the effect is the same. Voices once tangled in lively knots, but now you can hear your own heartbeat echo. You shuffle forward, your sandals, or maybe it's just your socks, scraping against worn stone. You imagine approaching the rostra, the speaker's platform where great orators once raised their voices. Cicero himself thundered about conspiracies here, convincing crowds to fear shadows as if they were assassins. And now, only weeds preach, their whispers rustling with the breeze. You step onto the platform, look out at the scattered ruins, and chuckle softly at the thought. Your audience tonight is a sleepy YouTube crowd in pajamas, probably fewer assassins, but no promises. The stillness is heavy, yet comforting. It's as if the city has been tucked in, allowed to dream for 1,000 years. You can't help but note the irony. The Romans designed forums to showcase vitality, to ensure no one forgot who held power, yet their eventual silence became the most memorable thing of all. You move past broken statues. A headless emperor still stands proudly, his toga frozen mid-fold, his gesture forever commanding an audience that no longer arrives. You pause, running your hand along the cold marble. Once, his likeness might have inspired obedience or even awe. Now, it looks more like an oversized coat rack. That's the funny thing about monuments. Over time, they go from terrifying symbols of authority to slightly absurd garden ornaments. The night deepens as you imagine what it must have been like for the first medieval peasants wandering through these abandoned squares. To them, the ruins weren't history. They were just eerie reminders of a vanished order. Some probably believed the gods themselves had cursed the place, or that giants built it before disappearing into the hills. One medieval chronicler even claimed Roman ruins were the work of demons, proof of some sinister magic long gone. If you squint, you can see how that story would spread. Big stone blocks, arches higher than treetops, all standing without explanation. When your own house is made of mud and straw, this place looks like something from another planet. Another layer of thought creeps in. You realize how forums were once symbols of central power, but later became convenient quarries. Many medieval builders carted off marble slabs, using them to make churches, barns, or even pigsties. You imagine a Roman senator's statue being smashed into pieces, its torso repurposed as a sturdy trough, recycling, medieval style, eco-friendly, if a little disrespectful. You glance upward, the stars shimmer faintly above, and you picture how the open forum would have glowed at night under torchlight. Vendors packing up, thieves slipping through shadows, couples strolling arm in arm. It was never truly silent back then. The idea of silence in a forum would have been absurd, like imagining Times Square with no neon signs. Yet here you are, centuries later, standing in that very silence. You walk toward the basilica remains, those long rectangular halls where judges once presided. Here, law was argued, decrees were issued, lives were altered. A sharp-tongued lawyer might sway a jury with clever words, while a nervous defendant sweated through his tunic. The basilica was the city's courtroom, city hall, and social club all rolled into one. Now the absent. Oof is gone and bats flutter in the rafters that aren't even there anymore. You tilt your head, amused at the thought that maybe even bats argue over territory here. The debate continues in your mind. Some historians suggest that forums emptied because people shifted their attention to churches. The new gathering spaces weren't political or commercial, but spiritual. Others insist economic decay came first, draining the lifeblood before religion filled the vacuum. You let the question float unanswered, because history rarely hands out tidy answers. A playful thought interrupts your reflection. If the Romans had Yelp, you wonder what reviews the forum would have had. 5 stars for fresh figs, -1 because Cicero wouldn't stop ranting. You stroll across the square again, slowing your pace, savouring the strangeness of it. Every ruined corner tells 2 stories, one of bustling life and one of quiet death. You feel the weight of both, but instead of sadness, there's a calmness. Cities die, but silence has its own beauty. A breeze brushes your cheek. You smell damp stone, earth, maybe even a faint hint of rosemary from some long-forgotten root clinging to life between cracks. You close your eyes and listen. The forum speaks not in voices, but in absence, and somehow that's enough. Your steps soften, and the silence becomes almost musical. You walk slowly out of the forum, carrying with you both the memory of noise and the tranquility of its absence, like carrying a tune you can hum but not quite sing. You wander away from the quiet forum, and the path draws you toward one of Rome's most famous symbols of ingenuity, the aqueducts. In the faint light of the moon, their arches loom against the sky, skeletal silhouettes stretched across valleys and hillsides. The air carries a damp chill, and though no water runs here now, you can almost hear the imagined whisper of streams rushing along stone channels. It is as if the earth itself still remembers the taste of flowing water. You pause at the base of one great arch. Its stones are weathered, cracked, but still holding after nearly 2 millennia. You tilt your head back, following its curve into the night. It is oddly humbling to think these aqueducts once carried millions of gallons of water daily into cities, fountains gushing, baths steaming, households cooking and cleaning. They were the arteries of Roman life. To live in a Roman city without them would have been unthinkable. Yet here you stand, and the channels are bone dry. A mainstream fact to ground you. At its height, Rome itself had over a dozen aqueducts, delivering water from springs and rivers many miles away. Some stretched nearly 60 miles, using nothing but gravity to carry water across landscapes. Imagine engineers so precise they could measure a drop of just a few inches over an entire mile, all without modern instruments. It's like building a perfect slip and slide for a city of 1 million. And yet, the silence now is thick. Without water, the fountains are mute, their basins filled with dust and weeds. You picture a medieval villager stumbling across this aqueduct and scratching his head. The stone arches stretch for miles, but to him it would have seemed utterly alien. No one maintained them after the empire fractured. Floods tore away sections, earthquakes shook down arches, and local people stripped stones for their own homes. To peasants who had never seen running water except from a well, these empty arches may as well have been ruins of gods. A quirky tidbit floats in. Ancient Romans sometimes mixed ground crocodile dung into cosmetics they claimed would protect the skin from the sun. Imagine slathering that on before going to the baths. If you think sunscreen today smells bad, just count your blessings. And now picture that same crocodile dung-wearing bather frowning when the aqueduct ran dry. Without water, even the strangest skincare routine was doomed. But historians still argue whether aqueducts fell out of use purely from neglect or if declining populations made them unnecessary. Was it that there weren't enough people left in some cities to justify upkeep, or did the loss of water drive people away first? Again, the egg and chicken debate looms. You crouch, running your hand over the damp base of the aqueduct, feeling cool stone that once carried life itself. The sensory picture sharpens. You imagine following a water channel as it snakes across hills, the trickle becoming louder until it bursts into a city fountain. Citizens once gathered there daily, filling jars, chatting, maybe complaining about taxes. You picture a baker washing his flour-dusted hands in cold water before kneading dough, children splashing each other near the fountains while mothers scolded them for wasting precious drops. And now, only the wind moves. The silence feels vast, but your imagination fills it with echoes. A procession of workers once trudged here, repairing leaks, cleaning sediment, ensuring the system flowed. Today, all you hear is the faint rustle of grass growing between fallen stones. You step carefully along a collapsed stretch, noticing how massive each block is, heavier than a car, fitted together without mortar. The craftsmanship feels eternal, and yet even eternity eventually falters. You chuckle softly, thinking how many medieval villagers must have tried to tug one of these blocks home. Honey, I found a perfect foundation stone for the pigsty. Another fact tugs at you. Even after the fall of Rome, some aqueducts still worked for centuries. But when Gothic invaders cut the lines leading into the city of Rome itself, fountains dried up and public baths closed. That was the moment when grandeur gave way to desperation. Bathing became a rare luxury. Some chroniclers even described the city as stinking, its once proud citizens reduced to fetching water from the Tiber River. Not exactly the glamorous eternal city tourists imagine today. You glance upward again. The moonlight turns the aqueduct's arches silver, casting long shadows across the ground. They look like ribs of some ancient beast, skeleton fragments stretching into the dark. The silence is heavier here than in the forum, almost pressing against your chest. Water once sang, but now the hush reigns. A light joke sneaks in. If the Romans had Yelp reviews for their aqueducts, they'd probably read, 5 stars, water is clear, pressure excellent, but wish it didn't collapse every time barbarians show up. You walk beneath one arch and imagine the moment it carried its last trickle. Perhaps a child cupped her hands, filling them with cool water, not knowing it was the final sip before centuries of silence. Perhaps an old man filled a jug, muttering about aching joints, unaware no water would follow the next morning. Endings rarely announce themselves. They just arrive. The debate lingers in your mind. Did neglect kill the aqueducts, or did shifting life simply move beyond them? Some see ties shrank to villages, their populations unable to sustain the grandeur of Roman infrastructure. Others faced repeated invasions, with pipes smashed deliberately by enemies eager to choke the city into submission. Scholars still argue, and you find yourself shrugging because the silence itself seems answer enough. Your feet carry you farther along the ruins, each arch like a doorway into the past. You brush moss with your fingertips, the dampness cool and grounding. You picture monks centuries later scavenging stone, chiseling away Latin inscriptions to reuse blocks for abbey walls. To them, these aqueducts weren't symbols of Rome, they were just convenient hardware stores. A breeze carries the smell of wet earth mingled with faint herbs from the hillside. You inhale deeply as though trying to taste the water that once flowed here. It isn't there, but your imagination insists on filling the absence. Another quirky moment. Some ancient Romans believed water carried spirits, that nymphs inhabited springs and rivers. Aqueducts, in their eyes, weren't just plumbing. They were sacred channels. Imagine walking along one at night, whispering a prayer to a water spirit, hoping she'd keep the flow clean and fresh. Maybe she left when the aqueducts dried, carrying her laughter elsewhere. You sigh, letting the weight of centuries settle. The arches stretch on, fading into darkness, and you follow their line until they vanish against the horizon. you think about how strange it is that something so practical, so vital, could also become so poetic in its absence. Without water, the aqueducts are useless, and yet, in ruin, they inspire awe far beyond their original purpose. You smile at the irony. The Romans built them for utility, not beauty. But now they survive mostly as beauty, haunting and skeletal against the stars. Perhaps that's the final joke history plays. What you intend to last one way may endure in an entirely different fashion. Your footsteps slow, your breathing deepens, and you let the silence pool around you. The aqueducts are no longer arteries of a living city. They are lullabies of stone, singing softly in their stillness, and you, walking here, are part of that song. You leave the long shadow of the aqueduct arches and drift toward quieter ruins on the edge of the city. The air grows stiller, the moonlight gentler as you pass through a lane of broken walls and half-collapsed columns. Here stand the villas, once dazzling homes of Roman elites, where marble floors gleamed, fountains bubbled in courtyards, and slaves bustled with trays of figs and honeyed wine. Now the houses gape open to the night, their mosaics chipped and half-buried, frescoes fading into dusty whispers. You pause at the threshold of a grand doorway, its frame cracked but still proud. Step inside with me. Imagine the crunch of gravel in a peristyle garden, the scent of roses and herbs drifting in warm air, the sound of trickling water from a small fountain shaped like a dolphin. This was no ordinary house. It was a performance space for wealth, a showpiece to remind every visitor that the owner had made it in Roman society. Now, the fountain is dry and weeds poke their heads through cracked marble. A mainstream fact to anchor us. Roman villas often had intricate floor mosaics, scenes of gods, hunts, or geometric designs so dazzling they still draw tourists today. One villa near Pompeii features a mosaic of a guard dog with the words Cave Canem, beware of the dog. Imagine stepping into a home with a permanent doormat warning you of Fluffy. That blend of artistry and humour feels oddly modern, like someone's first attempt at a novelty door sign. The quirky tidbit arrives too. Some villas were equipped with their own private heated floors thanks to the hypocaust system. Warm air circulated beneath tiles, keeping rushes toasty. You picture a Roman noble lounging in luxury, sipping wine while a slave stoked the furnace. Now, centuries later, the same tiles sit cold, their warmth long extinguished. And here you are, crunching through broken plaster where once the air shimmered with cozy heat. Historians still argue whether these villas were abandoned because owners fled during invasions, or if they simply decayed as wealth dried up. Did families pack what they could and leave in haste, or did generations simply fade away, leaving the house to crumble around them? Either way, the silence now feels heavy, as if the walls themselves miss the laughter and arguments they once contained. You step carefully into what was once a triclinium, the dining room. The frescoes here are faint, but if you squint, you can make out a painted grapevine curling across the wall. Centuries ago, reclining guests feasted here on couches, leaning on one elbow, while slaves served delicacies, roasted dormice, honey cakes, wine spiced with cinnamon. You chuckle, imagining someone spilling sauce onto a priceless mosaic and muttering the Roman equivalent of, "Don't worry, it'll come out in the wash." Now the room smells only of dust. You kneel and touch a fragment of mosaic tile, blue, still vibrant after so long. It's strange to think of the hands that placed it, one tiny piece at a time, creating beauty to last forever. Forever turned out to be fragile, yet even in ruin the artistry survives. You wander deeper. A collapsed wall opens into a bedroom, its plaster cracked. You imagine silk sheets once draped here, bronze mirrors polished to reflect candlelight. Perhaps a child once fell asleep to the murmur of servants, or a couple whispered late into the night about debts, politics, or neighbourhood gossip. Now, only crickets keep watch, chirping softly in the weeds outside. A sudden playful thought interrupts. Imagine a time traveller convincing a Roman aristocrat to install Wi-Fi in his villa. Yes, Lucius, you can now complain about politics on a global scale, not just at dinner parties. As you stroll through the remains, you notice a curious silence. Not just the absence of voices, but the absence of possessions. Archaeologists often find fragments, but rarely the treasures that once filled these homes. Statues carted away, bronze melted down, furniture rotted. It's like wandering through a stage set after the actors left, the props stolen, the spotlight gone. Another fact grounds you. Many villas weren't destroyed in single dramatic events, but slowly eroded by neglect. Roofs caved in from storms, vines crawled up walls, goats wandered in to graze. By the Middle Ages, some villas had become quarries, their marble carted off to build local churches. That's the great irony. Temples to Roman gods crumbled so Christians could build chapels. But even villas of private citizens fed the hunger for stone. The silence here is different from the forum or aqueduct. It's more intimate, like overhearing the ghosts of a family that once bustled through these rooms. You imagine them gathered for a meal, a child sneaking an extra honey cake, a dog barking under the table. You can almost smell bread baking in a clay oven, hear the squeak of a chair. And then you remember the oven is rubble, the chairs are dust, and the only dog left is the mosaic warning at the front door. Historians still debate whether such domestic spaces ever fully recovered after Rome's collapse. Did later generations try to live here, or were the ruins simply too large and impractical for medieval families? Some suggest that peasants squatted in the shells, cooking fires, blackening frescoes, goats chewing weeds in peristyle gardens. Others think the ruins were simply too eerie, too soaked in memory, and were avoided altogether. You step into the courtyard again, letting moonlight guide your gaze upward. The sky seems impossibly wide, framed by broken walls. You stand still, breathing in, and realize the villa's grandeur hasn't fully died. It lingers in the bones of architecture, in the mosaic fragments, in the faint smell of earth warmed by centuries. A light joke nudges you again. Imagine inviting friends over to a villa dinner party and saying, "Don't mind the ceiling leak, Jupiter's just blessing us tonight." You let your steps slow. The silence thickens, but it feels less lonely now. These villas tell you that wealth is temporary, comfort fragile, but artistry endures even when the wine runs dry. You leave the ruins gently, as though tiptoeing out of someone's dream. The villas sleep, but in their sleep they still whisper, still remind you that lives were lived here, messy, noisy, joyful, and fleeting. You turn back for one last look. The doorway still stands, cracked but upright, as if the house is still waiting for its family to come home. You know they never will. But you also know their laughter hasn't completely faded. It lingers in the stones, ready to echo in your imagination whenever silence falls this deep. And so you step back into the night, carrying their voices with you like faint embers glowing in the dark. You move beyond the hushed villas and follow a faint track through the city's edge, where the walls crumble into open countryside. The night air is sharper here, carrying scents of pine and earth. In the distance you imagine whispers, soft, urgent, and not Roman at all. These are the voices of tribes pressing at the borders, people the empire once called barbarians. Their presence lingers in the imagination like a low drumbeat, steady and unrelenting. You picture yourself standing at a Roman gate centuries ago, the towers manned by nervous guards, eyes straining toward the forests beyond. Smoke curls on the horizon. Rumors float back with merchants, stories of raids, of settlements burned, of strange songs sung in guttural languages. To you, tonight, they're only echoes, but to Romans of the time, they were omens. A mainstream historical fact gives weight to these murmurs. The empire endured waves of invasions, Visigoths, Vandals, Ostrogoths, Huns, each pressing harder as Rome's resources stretched thinner. In 410 CE, the Visigoths under Alaric famously sacked the city of Rome itself, a shock so great that even Augustine wrote about it, trying to reassure people the world wasn't ending. Spoiler, it kind of was, at least for the empire. A quirky tidbit to lighten the tension, some chroniclers claimed the invading tribes thought Roman baths were bizarre. Imagine stepping into a steaming hall, seeing dozens of strangers lounging naked and thinking, yep, this is sorcery. You laugh softly at the thought, culture shock at its finest. The Romans saw hygiene and socializing, newcomers saw a horror movie set. But historians still argue whether invasions alone caused the abandonment of Roman cities. Were barbarians the match that lit the fire? Or was the empire already smouldering with internal decay? Did cities fall because they were attacked, or were they tempting, hollow hells too weak to resist? You glance toward the hills, where shadows deepen, and feel the unease of uncertainty. You step forward into the countryside beyond the walls. Imagine torches flickering in the dark, warriors moving silently, their breath steaming in the night. To Roman citizens, these were terrifying figures, painted as savages. Yet many of these groups weren't so alien. They traded, settled, and sometimes even served in the Roman army. Picture a Germanic warrior earning Roman pay, drilling in formation by day, and humming tribal songs by firelight at night. Borders blurred even as tensions rose. You crouch by a patch of grass, running your hand across dew-damp blades. Centuries ago, this might have been a battlefield. The ground remembers. You imagine the clash of swords, the shouts, the chaos of men who didn't care about marble forums or aqueduct arches. To them, Roman cities were ripe orchards to be plucked. But silence reigns now. The tribes are gone, the Romans gone too, and only you remain to listen. The air hums with crickets, the sky lit with stars. It feels almost absurd that such quiet could follow so much violence. A playful thought nudges in. If Romans had had neighborhood watch apps, you can bet they'd be filled with alerts like suspicious group of vandals seen near the aqueduct, probably up to no good. You walk along a ridge and see in your imagination the clash of cultures. Roman villas once dotted this countryside, their walls painted bright. To invaders, these were treasures, but also puzzles. They stripped them, yes, but they also sometimes adopted Roman ways. Within a generation, the barbarian children might be learning Latin prayers, drinking wine, even hiring Roman tutors. And yet cities still emptied. The grand civic centres became too fragile, too expensive, too undefended. Another fact underscores this. When the Huns thundered westward in the 5th century, entire tribes fled into Roman territory seeking refuge. The empire absorbed them, but poorly, leading to rebellions and breakdowns. It's a reminder that collapse wasn't just battles, it was migrations, misunderstandings, and the slow erosion of control. You pass an old milestone leaning half buried in dirt. The inscription is illegible, worn to smoothness. Once it told travellers how far to the nearest city. Now it points to nothing. You trace it with your finger, imagining the worry of those who once passed here, listening for hoofbeats behind them. You glance at the stars again, silver and steady, so different from the chaos below. For Romans, those same constellations looked down when their world seemed eternal, and again when it crumbled. You sigh, amused by the thought. History might collapse, but Orion's belt just keeps strutting across the sky like a timeless fashion model. The silence around you thickens, and you let yourself picture the moment of abandonment. Perhaps families fled with bundles on their backs, glancing over shoulders at smoke rising from city gates. Or perhaps the process was slower, with households trickling out year by year, leaving shutters closed, forums quiet, and fountains dry. By the time invaders arrived, maybe there wasn't much left to sack. Historians still argue about this too. Was the fall of Rome sudden or gradual? Did people wake one morning to find the empire gone, or did it fade like a candle, unnoticed until the room was dark? You shrug, knowing the debate will never resolve, and walk on. A joke surfaces, light as the breeze. Imagine explaining Rome's fall to a Roman teenager. So, yeah, one day the aqueducts will be broken, the baths cold, and you'll be fetching water from a muddy well. The teen would probably roll their eyes and say, "Sir, you're dad." Whatever. You descend toward a meadow where ruins poke out like teeth. Perhaps this was once a watchtower, toppled now, its stones scattered. You sit on one block, cool and rough beneath you, and breathe. The countryside is calm, the city behind you sleeps, and the barbarians, those frightening whispers of history, are only ghosts now. Yet the silence they left is powerful. They didn't just end cities, they reshaped them, sometimes unknowingly, sometimes violently. Rome's boundaries blurred, its roads weakened, its cities shrank, and here you sit, centuries later, hearing only the faint hiss of wind through tall grass. You stand again, stretching, and let your steps carry you slowly back toward the ruins. The barbarians are gone, but their shadows linger in the silence of abandoned walls. You realize with a small smile that history is less about winners and losers than it is about whispers, quiet traces that remain long after the shouting ends. The path leads you gently downhill, back toward the city's core, where other echoes await. But for now, the whispers of the barbarians fade into the night, leaving you alone with starlight and the quiet reminder that empires, no matter how vast, can always be undone by footsteps in the dark. You drift back toward the city's quiet heart, stepping carefully along uneven stone. The air feels heavier now, as if the silence itself is weighed down by forgotten commerce. In the moonlight, you notice glints of something small and round scattered in the dirt. You crouch and scoop one up. It's a coin, tarnished green and worn almost smooth. A Roman denarius, once flashing silver, now dull in your hand. You brush it with your thumb, and for a fleeting second you imagine the clink of thousands, like it exchanging hands in a bustling market. But tonight there is no market. The stalls are gone, the shouting of vendors has faded, and the coins lie abandoned like seashells after a tide retreats. A mainstream historical fact sets the stage. During the late Empire, Roman currency suffered heavy inflation. Silver content in coins dropped, prices rose, and trust in money eroded. By the 3rd century CE, some coins were so debased they were nearly worthless, little more than shiny tokens. People who once bought fine fabrics and spices with a denarius found they could barely purchase bread. Here comes the quirky tidbit. In a few desperate periods, Romans tried bartering strange goods when money lost value. One record hints at soldiers being paid not in coins, but in salted pork. Imagine lining up for your paycheck and getting handed a slab of bacon. Sure, breakfast is covered, but good luck paying your rent in sausages. Historians still argue whether the collapse of Roman currency directly emptied the cities, or if it was just one symptom among many. Did people abandon towns because trade dried up, or was trade already dwindling when money lost meaning? It's another chicken and egg puzzle, glimmering like the coin in your palm. You rise slowly, letting the coin slip from your fingers. It lands with a soft thud in the dust, a sound swallowed instantly by silence. You walk forward, into what was once the marketplace, picturing rows of stalls draped with cloth, tables stacked with amphorae of olive oil, baskets of figs, bolts of dyed wool. Merchants would shout their prices, haggle with customers, and argue about taxes until their voices rasped. Children darted between stalls, stealing the occasional apple when no one looked. But now, only weeds grow through the stone, their roots weaving into cracks. You step on a paving slab and hear it wobble faintly, as if tired of holding the weight of centuries. The sensory picture grows sharper. Imagine the scents: cumin, pepper, cinnamon brought from the east, mingled with fish, cheese, and the unmistakable tang of sweat from too many bodies packed together. A donkey brays. A soldier jangles coins in his pouch. A woman clutches her child's hand tightly as she bargains. And now, nothing. Only your footsteps echo faintly, a ghost among ghosts. You kneel to examine a fallen stall post. It's rotted, gnawed by time, but you picture the colourful cloth that once stretched across it, shading customers from the sun. You imagine a weary merchant sitting there tallying coins at dusk, muttering about profits, perhaps dreaming of buying a villa with heated floors. You smile, remembering from earlier how those villas turned into silent shells. Dreams don't always age well. A playful thought intrudes. If Romans had invented credit cards, maybe things would have been different. Sorry, sir, your denarius has been declined. Please insert it again, shiny side up. You stroll further into the market square, noticing faint carvings on a stone step. Perhaps someone once scratched a tally there, marking debts or trade agreements. You run your fingers over the grooves, still sharp despite centuries. It's a reminder that even the smallest marks of business outlive the businesses themselves. Another fact adds weight. Trade didn't just fail from inflation. Barbarian incursions cut roads, piracy disrupted shipping lanes, and entire regions became unsafe. Without secure routes, caravans dwindled and exotic goods vanished. Silk, spices, and gems became rarities. When luxuries dried up, the markets lost their glamour. And when basics like grain couldn't reliably reach cities, people simply left. Why stay in a place where bread might not arrive? You picture a Roman baker closing his stall for the last time, shaking his head at an empty storeroom. Maybe he muttered something dramatic like, "Well, that's it, time to farm cabbages instead." The silence now feels heavier, as if layered with every abandoned transaction. You imagine coins rolling across the stone, scattering and never being picked up. You crouch again and pick another one up from the dust. It's nearly smooth, its image eroded. You tilt it in the moonlight, wondering if it bore the face of an emperor. Whoever he was, his command ended long ago, yet his ghost lingers in your hand. Historians still argue about the role of currency collapse in the wider fall. Some see it as a trigger, others as just a symptom of deeper problems: overextension, corruption, plague. You shrug softly. Arguments aside, the silence of the market square seems to answer in its own way. Money failed, and so did the bustle. A joke surfaces, gentle. Maybe the coins failed because no one could agree whose face should be on them. Do we mint with Augustus, or the guy who ruled for 12 days last year? To G.H. Call. You stroll past what might have been a money changer's booth. A flat stone slab lies cracked, but you can picture a man weighing coins, biting them to check purity, scribbling tallies on wax tablets. You imagine his sigh when the coins stopped mattering, when farmers refused to trade grain for silver, demanding tools or cattle instead. The market empties in your imagination. You see shutters drawn, stalls abandoned, pigeons settling where silks once fluttered. The city breathes out and sinks into itself, its once vibrant heart dulled. You lean against a pillar, cool under your hand. You close your eyes, breathing in. The silence is oddly soothing now, like the hush after a long day's noise. You realize the marketplace hasn't died completely. It just traded chatter for quiet, coins for weeds, haggling for the chirp of crickets. You step away, letting the silence follow you like a shadow stitched into your cloak. The coins stay behind, scattered tiny relics of vanished transactions. You smile faintly at the thought. In the end, money is just metal, but silence endures much longer. And so you leave the empty marketplace, the moonlight glinting off lost coins, carrying with you the faint clatter of an economy that once sang like a chorus, now reduced to a lullaby of quiet stone. You wander further from the hushed market, letting your steps guide you into a wide, echoing hall. The moonlight slips through broken windows, painting pale stripes across the marble floor. This was once a Roman bathhouse, the social engine of the city, and now the silence feels almost mocking. You can imagine the steam that once billowed through these rooms, the laughter, the gossip, the endless splash of water. Tonight, though, the pools are dry and the air smells only of stone and dust. You stand at the edge of what was once a caldarium, the hot room. Picture a shallow pool, its surface shimmering, while bathers lounged shoulder to shoulder, discussing politics, business, or the latest scandal. Everyone came here. Senators, soldiers, slaves, old men who argued philosophy, and children who splashed until scolded. The bathhouse wasn't just for hygiene, it was for community. And now the water is gone, leaving only cracked marble and echoes. A mainstream historical fact. At their height, Roman baths were feats of engineering. They used hypocauste systems, networks of furnaces and flues under the floors, to circulate hot air and keep the pools warm. Some complexes were massive, with libraries, gardens, and even gyms attached. The baths of Caracalla in Rome could host thousands at once. Imagine that, a city's heartbeat pulsing not in the forum, but in the steam. Now the quirky tidbit. Archaeologists found graffiti scrawled on bathhouse walls. People carved everything from crude jokes to love notes. One inscription in Pompeii simply read, "Secundus is a thief." Imagine being immortalized for eternity because someone caught you pocketing a bar of soap. You chuckle softly, the sound drifting through the empty chamber. Historians still argue whether the closure of the baths was symbolic of decline or just practical necessity. Did cities lose their soul when their baths fell? Cold, or did the fading wealth of cities simply make it impossible to keep furnaces stoked? Was the silence here a cause of urban collapse or just its reflection? You run your hand along the rim of the pool, cool stone where once heat shimmered, and wonder. You move into the frigidarium, the cold pool. The water here would have been icy, a shock after the hot rooms designed to tighten skin and refresh the body. Romans loved the contrast, moving from hot to cold like it was a ritual of rebirth. You crouch by the empty basin and picture someone plunging in with a gasp, splashing, laughing, sending waves across the pool. Now the basin is cracked, filled with shadows, and only your reflection in moonlight stares back. The silence feels heavy, but your mind fills it with voices. You hear men debating politics, soldiers boasting of victories, women sharing gossip about fashion and lovers. A barber once shaved customers in the corner, scraping razors across cheeks while offering his own sharp opinions. You grin. Every era has its talkative barbers. A playful thought intrudes. If bathhouses existed today in the same spirit, they'd probably come with free Wi-Fi and a juice bar. You'd sit in the hot pool scrolling your phone, pretending not to eavesdrop on strangers. Romans didn't have phones, but they had the same urge to gather, to talk, to soak. Another fact anchors you. When the aqueducts failed, so did the baths. Without constant water flow, without fuel for the furnaces, they closed. In Rome itself, chroniclers wrote of baths falling into disrepair by the 6th century. Citizens who once bathed daily now rarely washed, a cultural shift that shocked later historians. Cleanliness, once a Roman obsession, became a luxury. You step into the tepidarium, the warm room. This was the transition space, a gentle middle ground. You close your eyes, imagining the warmth seeping into your skin, the hum of quiet conversations, the scent of oils rubbed into shoulders. Here, people lingered, deals were struck, friendships formed, flirtations sparked. It was a room designed for comfort, for slowing down. Now the air is cool, and the only warmth is in memory. The debate echoes again. Did the baths close first, driving people into isolation, or did the isolation come first, leaving baths empty? Historians still argue, and you let the question float unanswered. The silence itself seems to suggest both. You run your hand across the wall, feeling rough plaster beneath your fingertips. Once it was painted with bright colours, reds, blues, yellows. Time and moisture have eaten it away, but fragments remain like faded dreams. You trace a patch of red, imagining the artist who brushed it on, never imagining the paint would outlive the laughter of bathers. A light joke rises in your mind. You picture a Roman standing here 2,000 years ago saying, "I'll just pop into the bath for 10 minutes. You grin, whispering back across centuries, "Sure. See you in 2 millennia." You stroll toward the palestra, the exercise yard attached to the baths. The paving stones are cracked, weeds sprouting through. You imagine men wrestling, running, lifting weights fashioned from stone. Sweat mixed with the scent of olive oil rubbed into skills. Some scholars note the baths were less about cleanliness than about display, showing off bodies, wealth, or social connections. The palestra was Instagram before Instagram, except with more grunting and fewer filters. Now it is silent. You hear only the chirp of a cricket, the soft sigh of wind. The palestra is just another empty yard, haunted by echoes of exertion. Another quirky tidbit. Romans often used strigils, curved bronze scrapers, to clean sweat and oil from their bodies. Archaeologists have found dozens, some beautifully decorated. You imagine standing in line here, waiting for your turn to be scraped down. Not quite the spa treatment modern minds imagine, but apparently effective. You wander back through the main hall. The pools are vast, the ceilings high, the silence overwhelming. You imagine torches flickering, steam swirling, voices rising. The bathhouse was once the city's heartbeat, and now it beats no more. You realize the silence here is more profound than in the forum or villas. Those spaces were about public display or private comfort, but this was about community. Its loss feels like a city forgetting how to be together. You pause at the doorway, looking back one last time. The moonlight makes the empty pools glow faintly, like ghostly water still lingers. You smile softly. Maybe the bathhouse isn't completely silent. Maybe its echoes are still splashing faintly across time. As you step outside, the night air feels cooler, fresher. You breathe deeply, letting the silence settle around you. The baths are gone, but their memory lingers, like steam dissipating slowly into the night sky. You drift from the hushed bathhouse into the tangled streets beyond, where broken walls lean together like tired old men whispering secrets. The silence here feels different, not just the absence of water or commerce, but the absence of a shared voice. Listen carefully. Once, the language that tied every corner of the empire together flowed here in steady rhythm. Latin rang out from forums to farmyards, from law courts to barracks, carrying laws, prayers, and jokes alike. But now, in the early medieval dark, you sense the tongue splintering, breaking apart like a clay jar dropped on stone. You walk past a faded inscription carved into marble, letters half gone, but still legible if you squint. Once, every passerby would have read it with ease. Now, even in its own age, peasants may have stumbled. Latin was shifting, bending into rustic dialects, mutating toward the future languages of French, Spanish, Italian. You hear it in your imagination, a market vendor shouting in rough Latin so twisted that a senator from Rome would scratch his head in confusion. A mainstream historical fact anchors this drift. By the 6th and 7th centuries, vulgar Latin dominated daily speech, while classical Latin remained mostly in books and law. The written and spoken tongues diverged until they felt like cousins who barely recognized each other. What had once been a unifying voice now fractured into regional dialects that slowly became whole new languages. Here's the quirky tidbit. Graffiti in Pompeii shows that even before the empire collapsed, ordinary people were already spelling words in wild, creative ways. Imagine a teenager in 79 CE carving sloppy Latin slang onto a wall, basically the ancient version of texting shorthand. Fast forward a few centuries and you can almost hear medieval kids rolling their eyes at proper Latin, speaking their own mashups instead. Some things never see out. Hangy. Historians still argue whether this linguistic shift helped doom the cities. Did communication fail first, with law and order collapsing because people couldn't understand decrees anymore? Or did the empire crumble for other reasons, leaving language free to wander without supervision? You lean against a broken arch, pondering. Either way, the silence here feels threaded with muttered words you can almost, but not quite, recognize. You picture a classroom centuries ago, a weary Roman teacher drilling students in classical Latin declensions, Rosa, Rosie, Rosam. The kids fidget, whispering their own rustic dialect behind his back. You grin, because somewhere in that restless classroom the seeds of French poetry or Italian opera are being planted without anyone noticing. The streets around you are narrow, shadowed. In your imagination, peasants shuffle past, speaking a language you half recognize, like a dream you can't quite recall. Maybe a farmer says, "I bring apples," but it sounds closer to "Je porte pomme" or "porto mele." The old tongue is dissolving and something new is rising even as the stones crumble around it. You step into what was once a small chapel. The Latin prayers echo faintly here, but you imagine the congregation reciting them in accents so thick the priest sighs. Latin may be eternal on parchment, but in human mouths it mutates endlessly. You kneel on the dusty floor, thinking how strange it is that language, something invisible, can outlast buildings yet change more radically than stone. Another fact grounds you. Churchmen worked hard to preserve pure Latin, copying texts in monasteries with obsessive care. Without them, the classics might have vanished. And yet while monks clung to Cicero and Virgil, villagers outside the abbey walls were inventing Spanish lullabies, French ballads, Italian love songs. The people's voices broke away, unstoppable. A playful thought interrupts. Imagine if Romans had invented spell check. Maybe Latin would have stayed uniform. Or maybe everyone would have just hit ignore and invented Italian anyway. You leave the chapel and stroll along another lane, ears tuned to phantom chatter. Children giggle in garbled Latin, mothers scold them in dialect, traders haggle with phrases that sound half familiar, half foreign. You realize the silence you hear now is layered. It isn't that people stopped talking, but that the language they spoke no longer connects to the stones. Historians still argue whether this shift should be called decay or transformation. Was Latin dying, or was it giving birth? The silence of the cities, then, isn't just about absence, it's about metamorphosis. You smile softly, deciding that silence can sometimes mean a language is simply catching its breath before speaking in new voices. You step through a doorway into what must have been a schoolhouse. The roof is gone, stars blinking down where once children sat with wax tablets. You imagine a teacher muttering, "Write this sentence correctly, Marcus amat puellum," and some boy carves instead, "Marco ama la ragazza." The teacher groans, but history winks because the wrong sentence is the future. You chuckle at the thought. Imagine being scolded for inventing Italian in math class. You wander further, past houses where inscriptions still cling faintly to lintels, names of owners, bits of verse, prayers. They read like Latin, but your mind already trant slates them into French cadences, Spanish rhythms. You realize that silence here doesn't mean nothing was said. It means the words simply shifted too far from the written traces. Another quirky glimpse: medieval scribes sometimes made hilarious mistakes when copying Latin. One monk famously doodled a cat chasing mice in the margin. Another wrote, "Oh, my hand is tired." You smile at the idea that even while preserving Latin, scribes were already bending it toward play, toward life. The silence feels softer now, not empty, but like a pause between songs. Latin had its verse, and now the melody is changing. You walk slowly, hearing echoes of troubadours, poets, peasants, voices rising from the ruins in new languages. You stop at a wall where ivy grows thick. Beneath it, faint carvings spell out a phrase, Roma Aeterna, eternal Rome. You laugh gently, whispering back, yes, eternal, but in accents you wouldn't recognize. The silence answers with a breeze, rustling the ivy like applause. And so you leave these fractured words behind. The streets are quiet, but you carry with you the realization that silence doesn't always mean death. Sometimes it means transformation, the old tongue dissolving so the new can rise. Latin sleeps in these stones, but in your ears you can already hear French lullabies, Spanish prayers, Italian songs, gentle proof that even in ruins, voices never stop. You drift deeper into the ruined city, leaving behind the broken syllables of Latin, and the path draws you toward a building that once held more treasure than gold. The silence here is heavier, not because it is empty, but because it is thick with the weight of lost words. You've arrived at the library, or at least what remains of it. Collapsed walls, charred beams, and fragments of shelves scattered like bones. Even in the stillness you feel the ghosts of scrolls and codices, thousands of them once lined up neatly, whispering knowledge to anyone who cared to listen. You step through the ruined doorway, the threshold chipped and worn. The moonlight falls in pale beams onto cracked tiles. You imagine rows of shelves stretching before you, wax tablets stacked on desks, scribes hunched in lamplight copying texts. The air smells only of dust now, but in your imagination it still carries the scent of parchment and ink. A mainstream historical fact grounds you. Roman libraries existed across the empire, from the grand halls of Rome to provincial towns. The Ulpian Library in Rome once held tens of thousands of scrolls, both Latin and Greek. For a time, literacy was not limited to monks or elites. Citizens could read speeches, histories, plays, and poetry. The empire spread not just armies, but ideas. Yet the quirky tidbit intrudes. Archaeologists once found a charred scroll in Herculaneum, carbonized by Vesuvius's eruption. Scholars today still struggle to read it with modern imaging technology. Imagine surviving a volcano only to be reduced to a smudged roll of ash, taunting scientists for centuries. You chuckle softly. the sound bouncing off empty walls, as if the scroll itself is still laughing at its stubborn refusal to be understood. Historians still argue whether the collapse of libraries caused the decline of Roman knowledge or if the decline had already begun. Making libraries irrelevant. Were books abandoned because people lost interest, or was interest lost because books were abandoned? The silence here doesn't answer, it only sighs, like a librarian shushing you for asking the wrong question. You step deeper, your hand brushing a fragment of wall where plaster still clings. Perhaps it once held painted frescoes of muses, goddesses of art and learning. You picture them now with folded arms, watching their shelves collapse, muttering, "Well, that's the end of civilization as we know it." The silence grows thicker as you imagine monks centuries later entering these ruins. They scavenged a handful of scrolls, carried them to abbeys, and copied what they could. Much was lost, not out of malice but neglect. Who needed manuals on Roman plumbing when the aqueducts no longer worked? Who cared for speeches on empire when empire was gone? Knowledge, like coins, became useless in a world where survival mattered more than elegance. You crouch by a fragment of pottery, running your fingers over its rough edge. Perhaps it once held ink. Perhaps a scribe dipped his reed pen here, scratching Cicero's words into a codex. You sigh, imagining his careful hand, unaware that centuries later his library would be nothing but rubble. A playful thought intrudes. What if Roman librarians had invented cloud storage? All scrolls backed up daily to Jupiter Drive, TM. You grin, amused by the absurdity, but also wistful. So much knowledge might have survived if only it had another home. Another fact anchors your thoughts. Works we consider classics today are only a fraction of what once existed. Livy wrote a history of Rome in 142 volumes, only 35 survive. That means most of Rome's story, its triumphs, defeats, gossip and scandals crumbled with the libraries. The silence in this hall isn't just the absence of voices, it's the absence of whole lifetimes of memory. You imagine walking down an aisle centuries ago, your fingers brushing scrolls wrapped in leather cases, titles inked neatly on tags, Virgil, Cicero, Ovid, Pliny. Students argued over them, philosophers muttered, politicians rehearsed speeches, and then the room grew quiet. Torches burned out, scrolls mildewed, silence won. Historians still argue about the famous burning of libraries. Did invading tribes torch them deliberately? Did neglect allow them to rot? Or did monks themselves destroy some texts they deemed pagan? No single answer satisfies, and the debate flickers on like a candle in the dark. You stand in the middle of the ruined hall, imagining whispers, not people but words themselves, phrases lost, verses unsung, laws unread. You strain to hear them, but silence covers everything like dust. Another quirky tidbit lightens the air. Roman libraries sometimes had chained books to prevent theft. Imagine sneaking in at night, trying to steal a scroll, and realizing you're basically shoplifting a roll of spaghetti attached to a chain. The thought makes you laugh softly, the sound startling a bat fluttering from the rafters. You walk toward a collapsed corner, stepping over rubble. Here, faint scorch marks stain the stone. Perhaps fire once licked this wall, devouring shelves. You kneel and press your hand against the cold surface, imagining the heat that once roared here. To the Romans, fire was the worst enemy of libraries. To you tonight, it is just a faded scar. The silence weighs heavier, and you realize this loss wasn't just books, it was confidence. A world that believed knowledge could be collected, stored and shared suddenly realized how fragile that dream was. Without roads, without trade, without empire, who needed libraries? The silence became an answer. No one. A playful joke whispers in your head. Imagine a Roman scholar watching his library burn and muttering, "I should have just written shorter books." You rise, moving slowly toward the exit. Behind you, the library sleeps in ruin, but you carry with you the realization that silence here doesn't mean ignorance. It means rebirth elsewhere. What was lost in scrolls lived on in fragments, carried into monasteries, whispered in classrooms, reborn centuries later as Europe woke again. You pause at the doorway, looking back. The moonlight makes the rubble glow faintly, as if shelves still stand, as if scrolls still wait. You bow your head, not in mourning, but in gratitude, for even fragments survived, enough to remind you that silence is never absolute. And then you step outside into the open air, where the night carries you forward. The library fades behind you, but its echoes linger, whispering gently, "Knowledge never truly dies. It only sleeps, waiting for voices to return." You leave the ruins of the library behind, stepping softly into streets where the moonlight falls in pale stripes between broken walls. The silence deepens as you approach a cluster of old temples. Their columns rise like ghostly trees, their once proud steps chipped and cracked, their statues faceless. But you notice something strange, signs of reuse. A pile of hay rests against one column, a low wooden door has been nailed into a marble arch, and faint traces of Christian crosses are scratched over the stone faces of Jupiter and Venus. You've entered the age when shrines and temples were no longer holy places of Rome's gods, but barns, storage sheds, and chapels. You pause at the base of one temple. Its facade is chipped but still grand, the marble glowing pale under the stars. You can almost picture the processions that once climbed these steps, priests in white robes leading oxen decorated with garlands, crowds cheering as incense filled the air. The gods watched from above, or so people believed. Now, in the silence, the smell is only of straw, the sound only the squeak of a mouse. A mainstream historical fact comes into focus. Across the late Empire and into the Middle Ages, many Roman temples were dismantled or repurposed. Pagan worship faded, and with the rise of Christianity, crosses were carved into temple walls. In some cities, entire shrines were stripped of bronze and marble to decorate churches. The sacred had not disappeared. It had simply been reassigned. Here's a quirky tidbit. One medieval account describes farmers storing grain inside a former temple, treating its marble floor as nothing more than a handy barn. Imagine Jupiter himself standing there, arms crossed, watching peasants shovel barley across his altar. You smile at the absurdity. History loves to recycle, sometimes in ways the original architects never imagined. Historians still argue was. Whether this repurposing represented destruction of the old religion or practical recycling of valuable space. Did Christians deliberately erase pagan sites, or were crumbling temples simply too useful to ignore? Was this an ideological purge or just convenient real estate? The silence of the ruins refuses to take sides. You step carefully into one of these altered temples. The roof is partly gone, so the stars peer down like curious eyes. In one corner, faint frescoes of Roman gods linger, Juno's face almost visible. But over them, someone has daubed a rough cross. The paint is faded, but the message clear. The city had turned its back on old gods. You imagine the awkward overlap when both faiths existed side by side. Perhaps a farmer muttered a prayer to Christ at sunrise and whispered one to Jupiter at sunset, just in case. Insurance never hurts. You move deeper, your feet crunching on straw. The silence feels layered here, as though it belongs both to the abandoned gods and to the peasants who later filled the space with everyday chores. You picture a woman scattering seed on the floor for chickens, her child chasing them, their laughter bouncing off marble that once echoed with solemn hymns. A playful thought intrudes. Imagine explaining this to a Roman priest. Yes, Pontifex, your grand altar is now a goat shed. Please mind the smell. The poor man would faint, toga and all. Another fact grounds your wandering. The Pantheon in Rome, one of the best preserved temples, survived because it was consecrated as a Christian church in the 7th century. Without that conversion, it might have been stripped for stone. So in some cases, Christianity's rise actually saved Roman buildings, even if it changed their meaning entirely. You pause at a toppled statue lying face down in the dirt. Its features are weathered away, but you can still sense power in its stance. Once, worshippers knelt before it. Now it's just a chunk of stone, half buried, ignored. You brush the moss from its shoulder, wondering if its silence is grief or relief. The debate echoes in your mind. Was this repurposing the death of pagan Rome, or its quiet continuation in disguise? Historians still argue, and maybe they always will. For you, tonight, the silence here feels like a compromise. The gods gave way, but their temples endured, even if as barns. You step back into the night air. Another shrine looms, smaller but intact, its doorway bricked up. Above the entrance you can just make out Latin words chiseled centuries ago. The letters are worn, but they once dedicated the place to Mars, god of war. You imagine a Christian villager scratching a cross on that same stone, muttering, "Better safe than sorry." Faith shifts, but the walls endure. The silence deepens as you picture monks later salvaging stone to build monasteries. They hauled marble from temples, carved new altars, erased old inscriptions, yet, in doing so, they preserved fragments. The temples didn't vanish, they transformed, their voices altered but not silenced completely. Another quirky image surfaces. Medieval peasants believed some temples were haunted. They avoided them at night, whispering that pagan gods still wandered the ruins, sulking. Imagine stumbling into a goat shed in the dark and blaming it on a rumpy Jupiter. You chuckle softly, the sound swallowed by night. You walk slowly between columns, your hands brushing cool stone. These pillars once held roofs that soared, painted ceilings, golden statues. Now they hold only stars, but the stars feel like a fitting ceiling. You realize the silence of these temples isn't defeat. It's survival, different, humbler, but survival nonetheless. A playful joke sneaks in. Maybe the gods themselves approved of their temples becoming barns. After all, who doesn't love free goat cheese? You linger at the steps, gazing back at the shadowed shrine. Its silence is gentle, not bitter. The old prayers are gone, but new prayers rose. The gods may have vanished, but the stones remained useful. In that there is a kind of immortality. You step away, back into the quiet streets. Behind you, temples slumber with chickens and saints alike, their silence a blend of endings and beginnings, and you, walking under the moon, carry their whispers forward, knowing that silence sometimes means not death but adaptation, the reshaping of sacred space into something practical, human, and enduring. You wander away from the temples turned barns, the faint smell of hay still clinging to your clothes, and your steps lead you toward another presence in the city. This silence feels less about absence and more about transformation. Ahead, a flicker of light breaks the monotony. Imagine it, a chapel lamp glowing faintly, its flame steady against the dark. You've arrived at the moment when Christianity reshaped the cities, when crosses replaced eagles, and the echoes of prayers began to sound in new rhythms. You pause at the threshold of a small chapel built within the bones of an older Roman hall. The doorway is plain, rough stone patched together from whatever rubble was at hand. Yet the silence inside is charged, alive. Where once senators argued or merchants shouted, now voices whisper psalms, prayers, and hymns. You close your eyes and let the imagined sound wash over you, slow chants reverberating in simple harmony, filling the night with a gentler power than Jupiter's thunder ever held. A mainstream historical fact anchors this shift. By the 4th century CE, Christianity had not only spread across the empire but gained official support after Constantine's conversion. By the late empire, churches replaced civic buildings as the centers of life. Baptisteries, basilicas, and shrines rose in the ruins of forums. The city's heart shifted from marble courtyards to candlelit sanctuaries. Here comes the quirky tidbit. Early Christians often repurposed Roman symbols with clever twists. The ichthys, or fish symbol, was both a secret code and a pun in Greek. Imagine Roman neighbours scratching their heads when they saw little fish doodled on walls, thinking it was graffiti advertising seafood. You chuckle softly, your laugh blending with the imagined echoes of chants. Historians still argue whether Christianity hastened the fall of the cities or saved them. Did focus on ritual life pull energy away from civic upkeep? Or did churches become the glue holding communities together when secular structures collapsed? The silence here doesn't answer. It only hums, as if both are true at once. You walk into the chapel's nave. The floor is simple, no mosaics of myths or heroes, just rough stone. On the walls, faint traces of painted saints replace frescoes of gods. Their eyes are solemn, their gestures calm. You imagine villagers gathered here at dawn, praying for harvests, for health, for peace. Where once they sought favor from many gods, now they asked one. The air feels warmer in your imagination. Incense curls upward, the smoky sweetness lingering in your nose. A priest lifts a chalice and the congregation bows their heads. Outside, the city crumbles, but inside, a different kind of order is forming. A playful thought intrudes. If Romans had Yelp reviews for chapels, they'd probably read 5 stars. Warm light, good chanting, bread and wine included, would pray again. You stroll toward what might have been the apse, where once a statue of an emperor or deity might have stood. Now a rough cross of wood rises, its surface uneven, but somehow it feels sturdier than marble. You kneel briefly, not in devotion but in respect, sensing the weight of transition. Another fact grounds you. By the 6th century, bishops had become some of the most powerful figures in cities. They organized defenses, distributed food, and kept records. In many ways, they replaced Roman officials, becoming both spiritual and civic leaders. The silence of forums gave way to the murmured authority of church councils. You imagine a bishop standing at the pulpit, his voice echoing through this modest hall. Perhaps he reassured the people that though Rome's empire crumbled, God's kingdom would not. Perhaps villagers believed, finding comfort in promises that reached beyond walls and roads. You sigh softly, realizing that silence in ruins doesn't always mean despair. It can mean hope rerouting itself. You step back into the aisle, your feet brushing against dust. In your imagination, candles flicker at shrines, some made of salvaged Roman stone, once dedicated to pagan gods, now serving saints. You picture a marble altar with faint Latin inscriptions scratched away, replaced by a crude cross. The layers of history fold over each other like palimpsests, each leaving traces. Historians still argue whether Christian charity truly softened the blows of collapse. Some say bishops fed the poor and gave cities a reason to survive. Others insist the focus on heavenly rewards distracted from earthly repairs. You smile, letting the debate drift away. The silence of this chapel feels too gentle to quarrel. You linger near the door, watching in your mind as peasants shuffle in, heads bowed. Their voices rise in hymn, simple, unpolished yet earnest. The sound fills the ruin, weaving warmth into broken walls. Outside, aqueducts crumble, markets empty, roads crack. Inside, voices cling together, finding community in belief. A playful image surfaces. Imagine a Roman senator from centuries earlier wandering in by mistake. He sees peasants singing about salvation and mutters, "This is not how forums are supposed to work." Then he sits down, and maybe, just maybe, he joins in. The silence after their hymn fades is profound. You hear only your own breath, steady, calm. You realize that this silence doesn't feel abandoned, it feels sacred. It is not the hush of loss, but the hush after prayer. Another. A quirky fact lightens the mood. Medieval monks sometimes added jokes into their manuscripts of psalms. One drew a doodle of a grumpy cat in the margin. Another scribbled rude notes about bad singers. Faith was solemn, yes, but also human. You smile, imagining peasants in this chapel chuckling quietly at the same imperfections. You walk slowly out of the chapel. The night air feels cool on your face, but you carry with you the warmth of flickering lamps and whispered hymns. The silence here has changed. It isn't empty like the forum or cold like the aqueduct. It is filled with faint echoes of prayer still humming across centuries. As you step back into the moonlit street, you realize that the Roman city didn't simply vanish. It transformed. The eagles fell, but the crosses rose. The temples emptied, but chapels glowed. The silence that followed wasn't the end. It was a different kind of beginning. And so you continue forward, the flicker of Christianity following you into the night, its whispers steady, its light faint but unbroken. You step away from the chapel's glow and follow a shadowy street that seems wider than the others, its paving stones worn smooth from countless footsteps. Ahead rises a massive curve of stone, looming against the night sky like the ribcage of some colossal creature. As you draw nearer, the silence thickens. You have arrived at the amphitheatre, once a thunderous arena of spectacle and blood, now an empty bowl of shadows where only the wind performs. You pause at the arched entryway, your hand brushing the cool stone. Imagine the roar that once poured out of this gate. Thousands of voices chanting, cheering, jeering, the clatter of armor, the trumpets blare, the sudden hush before a fight. Today, the silence is absolute, broken only by your footsteps. You slip through the arch and emerge into the arena's center. The moonlight pools across the sand, pale and cold, as if the amphitheatre itself still holds its breath. A mainstream historical fact gives weight to your imagination. Amphitheatres across the Roman world hosted gladiatorial combat, animal hunts, public executions, and even mock naval battles. The Colosseum in Rome could seat 50,000 spectators, each ticket free of charge because emperors knew that bread and circuses were cheaper than rebellion. Entertainment was empire glue. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some amphitheatres were flooded deliberately to stage naval battles called normachiae. Wooden ships were floated in, and combatants splashed and crashed while crowds cheered. Imagine the absurdity, a mini ocean in a stone bowl, with gladiators rowing clumsily, probably praying not to drown before being stabbed. You grin softly, shaking your head at the Romans' flair for drama. But historians still argue whether the decline of amphitheatres symbolized the moral decay of Rome or simply the loss of resources to stage such events. Did citizens lose their appetite for, or spectacle, or did rulers stop paying for it? Were empty seats signs of shifting values or just empty coffers? The silence here doesn't take sides, it only lingers as if the walls themselves can't decide what story to tell. You walk slowly across the arena floor. The sand crunches beneath your feet. You picture a gladiator centuries ago, standing exactly where you stand, sweat dripping, sword trembling. He looks up at the crowd, 30,000 people chanting his name or someone else's. He knows that in a few moments, silence may fall for him permanently. You exhale softly, aware of how strange it is to feel empathy across such gulfs of time. The silence now feels thicker because it once held so much noise. You tilt your head and in your imagination, faint echoes ripple. The growl of lions, the clash of steel, the shrieks of spectators. But the ghosts fade quickly, leaving only crickets chirping in the weeds that sprout between seating rows. A playful thought intrudes. If the Romans had invented sports commentators, imagine them narrating gladiatorial fights with modern flair. And here comes Marcus the Mighty, sponsored by olive oil imports of Gaul. You chuckle softly, your laugh swallowed by the massive space. You climb a few rows of the stone seating. The steps are uneven, worn down by centuries of sandals. You sit and gaze across the arena, letting moonlight paint its vast emptiness. It strikes you that these seats once held every layer of society. Senators in front rows, peasants in the back, women and children huddled high above, all voices mingled into one roar. Now, only your breath fogs the night air. Another fact grounds you. By the 5th century, many amphitheatres fell into disuse. Christianity disapproved of blood spectacles, and civic leaders lacked funds to maintain them. Some were converted into fortresses, their arches bricked up to house soldiers or peasants. Others became quarries, their stones carted away to build churches. Silence arrived not suddenly, but gradually, like weeds overtaking stone. You stand again, wandering through the corridors beneath the seats. The vaulted passages are dark, cool, and damp. You imagine gladiators waiting here, leaning against the walls, listening to the crowd above. Some prayed to gods, some cursed their luck, some joked with comrades to mask their fear. The silence now feels almost respectful, as if the building remembers their final moments. A quirky tidbit flickers. Archaeologists once found graffiti in gladiatorial barracks praising favourite fighters like celebrities. Spiculus the victor, one reads. Think of it as the ancient version of fan clubs and merch, except the merch was probably a broken helmet rather than a t-shirt. Historians still argue whether gladiatorial games truly declined because of Christian morality or because the empire simply couldn't afford them anymore. You let the debate fade. The silence here feels too heavy to fill with arguments. You emerge into the upper rows again, the view vast. The moon spills across the empty seats, and you realize amphitheaters were designed not just for spectacle, but for community. Whole cities gathered here, shouted here, shared here. Their silence now mirrors the silence of the city itself. Communities unraveling, people drifting away, the glue of shared spectacle drying up. A light joke surfaces. Imagine the disappointment of the last Roman who showed up here expecting a fight. He sits down, munching stale bread, and mutters, "Well, this is awkward." You steed, and quietly, letting the silence wrap around you. The amphitheatre feels less like a ruin and more like a giant sleeping creature. Its ribs are still strong, its heart still faintly beating in memory. You wonder if silence here is less about death and more about rest, an arena dreaming of crowds long gone. You make your way back down to the arena floor. The sand glows pale under the moon, like ash. You kneel briefly, pressing your palm into it. Once, this sand drank blood. Tonight, it drinks only moonlight and the soft press of your hand. That, somehow, feels like healing. Another quirky thought, some medieval villages used amphitheatres as markets once the games ended. Imagine buying chickens and bread where lions once pounced. History loves its ironic recycling. You walk slowly to the exit arch. The walls loom tall, their stones rough but enduring. You glance back one last time. The amphitheatre sits quiet, its silence not empty but watchful. like a guardian waiting for voices to return. You nod gently, acknowledging its long patience. Stepping outside, the night air feels cooler, fresher. You breathe deeply, realizing that the silence of the amphitheater has followed you, lingering in your chest like a faint hum. You carry it with you as you step back into the ruined streets, leaving behind the giant bowl of shadows, but not the memories it whispered. You leave the shadow of the silent amphitheater behind and follow a road that feels oddly barren. The moonlight reveals empty stalls, half-toppled warehouses, and docks along a riverbank where no boats wait. The air is colder here, carrying not incense or smoke, but the faint scent of stagnant water. You've come to the place where the city's lifeblood once flowed in and out, its trade routes. Now their silence is perhaps the most unsettling of all, for it tells you that the world beyond the walls has also turned its back. You pause near a collapsed warehouse, its roof beams jutting upward like broken ribs. Imagine it centuries ago, crates stacked high with wine amphorae, sacks of grain, bolts of linen, jars of oil. Dock workers shouted, ropes creaked, and ships bumped against the pier as goods were hauled in and out. A single coin exchanged here linked faraway worlds, spices from India, silk from China, amber from the Baltic. Rome's reach was global before global was even a word. Tonight, though, the air is still and the only sound is a rat rustling in the weeds. A mainstream historical fact steadies your thoughts. Rome's trade routes were immense networks by land and sea, stretching from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Mesopotamia. Salt, grain, and wine flowed steadily, but so did luxuries like pearls, cinnamon, and ivory. The empire's prosperity depended on these arteries staying open. When they clogged, the body of Rome weakened. Here's the quirky tidbit. Roman merchants once shipped live flamingos as luxury pets. Imagine the chaos of transporting long-legged pink birds across the Mediterranean and the sheer absurdity of explaining to customs, "Yes, this crate honks. No, it's not contraband." You chuckle softly, the sound bouncing off the empty stone walls. Historians still argue whether the collapse of trade routes doomed Roman cities outright or whether the decline of cities made trade unprofitable first. Did caravans stop because cities couldn't buy their goods, or did cities starve because caravans stopped arriving? The silence of these abandoned docks doesn't answer, it only sighs. You step onto the broken pier. The wood is rotted, its posts gnawed by time. You picture a merchant standing here, scanning the horizon for ships that never came. Perhaps he muttered curses, perhaps he prayed, perhaps he finally walked away, leaving the pier to sink slowly into silence. The sensory imagination sharpens. You hear waves lapping softly, ropes creaking, seagulls squawking overhead. But when you open your eyes, no ships float on the river, no sails flap in the night breeze. The water reflects only moonlight, smooth and cold. The silence feels like a withheld breath. A playful thought intrudes. Imagine a Roman trader trying to sell flamingos in medieval Europe. They eat a fortune in shrimp, they squawk at dawn, but trust me, they're a status symbol. You laugh under your breath, startling yourself with how ridiculous and sad it sounds. You move toward the warehouse again, stepping inside the skeletal frame. The stone floor crunches under your sandals. You imagine a caravan once unloading here, camels kneeling, donkeys braying, men shouting in Arabic, Greek, and Latin. Spices scented the air, cardamom, pepper, saffron. The place must have smelled like a global stew. Now it smells of mildew. Another fact grounds you. Piracy in the Mediterranean increased as Rome's naval power weakened. Without protection, ships were easy prey and merchants abandoned risky routes. Inland, bandits prowled the roads, once kept safe by legions. Suddenly, goods didn't arrive, markets dried up, and cities shrank. Silence followed like a shadow. You walk deeper into the warehouse ruins, running your hand across a collapsed column. You imagine tally marks once scratched here by a scribe tracking inventory. Perhaps he dipped a stylus into ink, wrote 50 sacks of grain, and set his tablet aside. That tablet is dust now, and the column holds no marks. The silence feels like paperwork left unfinished for eternity. A light joke comes to you. Imagine being a Roman accountant explaining to a barbarian why flamingos count as taxable assets. Yes, sir, pink birds are absolutely deductible. You step outside and follow the riverbank. The silence stretches wide here, not just the hush of ruins, but the hush of absence. Trade routes were never just about goods. They carried ideas, fashions, even diseases. Without them, cities weren't just poor, they were isolated. You pause, realizing that silence is another kind of wall cutting the city off from the rest of the world. Historians still argue whether isolation doomed urban life. Was it the lack of luxuries that mattered, or the lack of grain? Did cities collapse because bellies emptied, or because minds stopped receiving new ideas? You shrug softly, the debate lost in the night wind. You picture a caravan struggling through a mountain pass, snow whipping at the faces of traders. Maybe they turned back, muttering that no city was worth the risk. You imagine sailors on a storm-tossed ship, their cargo spilling into waves, their prayers unheard. Slowly, the arteries closed, and the city's silence thickened. Another quirky tidbit. Roma. Garum, a fermented fish sauce, was so popular it was shipped across the empire in huge jars. People adored it despite its smell. Some called it liquid stink. Imagine caravans hauling amphorae of this pungent sauce through the countryside. You smile, thinking the Middle Ages probably didn't miss that particular delicacy. You reach a crumbled stone wall where once the customs house stood. You lean against it, gazing at the river. In your imagination, a line of merchants once waited here to pay taxes, grumbling loudly. Now the wall listens only to crickets and frogs. The silence is almost smug, as if it knows it has outlasted even taxes. The thought amuses you. Silence is the only tax collector that never stops working. You walk slowly along the road leading away from the river. The paving stones are broken, weeds sprouting thick between them. You imagine caravans once stretching down this road, bells jingling on mules, merchants laughing, the smell of dust and sweat heavy in the air. Tonight, your footsteps are the only rhythm, the road leading to nowhere. You pause, realizing the silence of these trade routes is different from other ruins. The forum's silence felt civic, the bathhouse's silence communal, the amphitheatre's silence theatrical. But here the silence feels like starvation. Without trade, cities withered like orchards without rain. Another playful image pops up. Imagine a Roman child asking his father where the silk went. "Sorry, son, no more silk. The traders stopped coming." "So what do I wear now?" "Wool, lots of itchy wool." You laugh softly, the sound muffled by night. The silence of the road accepts your joke but doesn't laugh back. You step onto a ridge overlooking the city. Below, you see its ruins sprawled, temples, forums, villas, baths, amphitheatres, all silent. And beyond, you picture roads once teeming with carts, rivers once fuller of ships, seas once dotted with sails. Now only the stars travel freely, their routes unbroken. You stand still, breathing in. The silence here feels vast, stretching beyond the city into the entire empire. It is not the silence of one place, but of connections broken, networks vanished. And you realize that silence is the final answer trade routes give. When goods stop flowing, voices stop too. You turn slowly back toward the city, the quiet docks fading into shadow behind you. The silence follows, a steady companion as you continue your journey deeper into the sleeping heart of Rome. You leave the hushed riverbanks and broken trade houses behind. stepping into narrower streets where the air feels heavier, stagnant. The silence here is different. It's not the calm hush of abandoned markets or the steady emptiness of dry aqueducts. It is a silence that feels hollowed out, as if the air itself remembers screams that once rattled through these alleys. You've walked into the shadow of plague, into the part of history where invisible enemies hollowed out entire cities. You pause in a small square. The paving stones beneath your feet seem ordinary, but you imagine them covered centuries ago with hurried burials, with fires meant to cleanse the air, with desperate prayers muttered through cloth pressed against mouths. The Romans didn't fully understand disease, but they knew fear when it swept through the streets. Tonight, the silence tastes of that fear, lingering long after the last cough faded. A mainstream historical fact anchors you. In the late Empire, outbreaks of plague struck repeatedly. The Antonine Plague in the 2nd century may have killed millions, likely brought back by soldiers returning from campaigns. Later came the plague of Cyprian in the 3rd century, crippling the empire further. And still later, the Justinianic plague of the 6th century devastated Constantinople and its provinces. Urban centres were especially vulnerable. Close quarters, poor sanitation, and stagnant water made them breeding grounds for death. Here's a quirky tidbit. Ancient doctors sometimes recommended wearing amulets or even carrying a live chicken under your arm to ward off illness. Imagine walking through the city terrified of plague, clutching a squawking chicken like your personal health insurance policy. You can't help but grin at the ridiculousness of it, though the laughter feels uneasy in the silence of this square. Historians still argue whether plagues alone emptied cities, or whether they merely accelerated decline already in motion. Did disease topple Rome, or did it simply strike when Rome was already stumbling? The silence here, haunted and brittle, offers no clear answer. You step toward a doorway, its lintel cracked, its interior shadowed. Imagine a family huddled inside centuries ago, hearing neighbours coughing next door. The father whispers prayers to gods, or later, to Christ. The mother burns herbs to chase away evil air. Children are told to stay inside, to be quiet, though fear leaks from every corner. One day the door opens and only silence comes out. You shiver, though the night air is calm. You imagine the streets littered with discarded belongings, abandoned carts, and perhaps a body carried swiftly by men who wore cloth over their faces, praying not to breathe too deeply. The silence feels thick with absence of voices, of footsteps, of laughter. Another fact grounds your thoughts. During plagues, urban populations could drop by half or more. Whole neighborhoods emptied, farmers abandoned fields, trade dwindled further, and soldiers died in droves. The empire's military and economy staggered under the weight of invisible death. Silence wasn't just in the streets, it was in the very functioning of society. A playful thought intrudes, though you wince at its gallows humour. Imagine ancient influences during a plague. Hey guys, today's tip. Wear your lucky amulet and don't forget to pet your chicken. Smash that like button if you're still alive. You chuckle softly, the absurdity easing the heaviness for a moment. You continue along the alley. In your imagination, funeral pyres once burned here, their smoke choking the air. Priests muttered prayers, neighbours whispered rumours. Was it punishment from the gods, from demons, from the anger of ancestors? Some blamed foreigners, some blamed sin, some simply fled. Tonight there is no smoke, only the faint smell of earth cooling in the night. Historians still argue about the true scale of these plagues. Some records exaggerate numbers, others downplay them. Was it millions? Or tens of millions? The silence makes every number possible because silence doesn't count, it only endures. You step into what must have been a bathhouse courtyard, long since emptied. You remember earlier how the baths had already grown cold when aqueducts failed, but plague sealed their fate. Imagine people once believing the baths spread disease, abandoning them out of fear. A place once filled with gossip and laughter turned into another tomb of silence. Another quirky tidbit. Romans sometimes lit giant bonfires in public spaces, believing smoke could cleanse the air. Imagine the entire forum filled with smouldering fires, citizens coughing on smoke while hoping it would keep plague away. In a way, it was the empire's first misguided attempt at air purifiers. You climb a stairwell of broken stone, emerging onto a roof with a view over the ruins. In your imagination, the rooftops once buzzed with life, families sitting outside to escape stifling heat, neighbors calling to one another, children chasing each other across tiles. During plague, perhaps too, these rooftops held watchers, eyes scanning streets for signs of sickness, for wagons carrying away the dead. Now the rooftops are empty, weeds sprouting between tiles, silence stretching wide. You let your breath slow, the silence pressing gently against your chest. The plague's legacy wasn't just death, it was suspicion. Cities became places of fear, where every cough sounded like a death knell, where neighbors eyed each other warily. You realize the silence here is not peaceful. It is mistrust fossilized. A joke slips in to lighten the weight. Imagine a Roman father scolding his son during plague times. Don't play outside, you'll catch the sickness. But Dad, the neighbor has a chicken amulet. Fine, but stay 6 feet apart. You grin at the unintentional echo of modern fears. Another fact deepens the picture. After major plagues, cities often never recovered their full populations. Survivors moved to the countryside where space felt safer, where fields offered food and fresh air. The silence of urban centers grew not just for a season but permanently. You stand still, letting moonlight wash over the ruins. The silence of plague is heavier than any other so far. It is not the silence of abandonment by choice, nor of decay by neglect. It is the silence of sudden absence, of voices cut short, of laughter that ended mid-breath. Historians still argue how plagues shaped the medieval world that followed. Did they destroy Rome or simply clear space for something new to grow? You sigh softly, knowing there's no easy answer. But the silence here feels less like a period and more like an ellipsis, something trailing off, waiting for the next voice. You turn back toward the street, your footsteps quiet. Behind you, the silence of plague lingers like a shadow, reminding you that sometimes the loudest disasters leave no sound at all, only empty space, waiting for the living to fill it again. You leave the square where plague silence clung to the stones and wander into the outskirts of the city. The air feels fresher here, carrying the scent of soil, of fields tilled long after the city's heart fell quiet. You notice broken walls patched with mud, marble blocks stolen from grand buildings now forming crude huts. In the moonlight you see the outline of vegetable gardens where once courtyards held fountains. You've stepped into the patchwork world of peasants, where city dwellers drifted back to the land, trading marble for mud and silence for the low hum of farm life. You pause by a crumbled arch. Through it, you imagine families hauling baskets of grain, children chasing goats, women weaving flax while humming songs in rustic dialects. The silence here is softer, not hollow like plague or abandoned like trade routes, but muted, practical, steady. It's the silence of people surviving quietly outside the grandeur that once defined them. A mainstream historical fact steadies your step. As Roman infrastructure failed, urban populations shrank dramatically. Archaeological surveys show entire neighborhoods in cities like Trier or Arles abandoned, while rural settlements expanded. People left civic centers for farms where they could grow their own food rather than rely on crumbling markets. Cities that once held tens of thousands dwindled to villages of a few hundred. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some medieval peasants reused Roman mosaics as barn floors. Imagine sweeping hay across tiles depicting Neptune or Bacchus, pausing only to mutter, "Nice pattern, shame about the mud." You chuckle softly at the absurdity of emperor's art becoming a chicken coop floor. Historians still argue whether this rural drift was decline or adaptation. Did people abandon civilization or simply redefine it? Was the collapse of cities a tragedy or a logical move towards sustainability in uncertain times? You shrug, because the silence of these farmlands seems more content than mournful. You step into a field in your imagination, rows of wheat shimmering under the moonlight. A farmer stoops with a sickle, his back bent, his face weathered. He doesn't dream of marble baths or golden forums. He dreams of bread on the table, a roof that doesn't leak, children growing strong. For him, survival is enough. The sensory picture deepens. You smell damp soil, fresh straw and smoke from a hearth nearby. You hear the creak of a wooden cart, the bray of a donkey, the soft murmur of a lullaby sung by a tired mother. This silence is different. It's filled with small sounds, gentle and unremarkable, but steady as heartbeat. A playful thought intrudes. Imagine trying to explain Roman grandeur to this farmer. Once, your people built aqueducts 60 miles long. He shrugs, pats his donkey and says, "Yes, but can an aqueduct plough my field?" You laugh softly, realizing he has a point. Another fact grounds your reflection. Taxation in the late empire pushed many peasants into a system of dependency on wealthy landowners. This proto-feudal arrangement meant people worked fields not for cities but for lords. Cities lost power because grain no longer flowed inward, it was consumed locally. The empire had once been a web of supply chains, now it was a quilt of small farms. You walk past a ruined villa, its columns toppled, but notice a patch of new thatch on part of the roof. In your imagination, peasants live here, huddled in one wing of what was once a palace. The grand frescoes are smoke-stained, the marble floors layered with dirt, but chickens scratch in the courtyard and goats bleat in the halls. The silence of luxury has been replaced by the noise of necessity. Another quirky tidbit. Archaeologists have found evidence of medieval farmers using Roman sarcophagi as water troughs. Imagine leading your thirsty ox to drink from a coffin carved with battle scenes of Achilles. History, it seems, has a sense of humour. You kneel by a row of herbs, smelling rosemary and thyme. You picture a woman plucking leaves for a stew, her hands rough, her clothes patched. She doesn't quote Cicero or Virgil. She hums a tune taught by her grandmother. Her silence is filled with work, not philosophy. Historians still argue whether this ruralization meant cultural collapse. Some say it marked the end of literacy, art, and civic pride. Others argue it preserved what mattered most, life itself. Standing here, you sense both are true. The silence of peasants is not tragic, but it is humble, stripped of grandeur. A light joke bubbles up. Imagine a Roman aristocrat coming back to check on his villa centuries later. "Where are my statues?" A peasant waves from the barn. "Your horse trough is very useful, thanks." You stroll through a small hamlet where huts cluster against the ruins. Smoke curls from chimneys, and in your imagination dogs bark lazily while men return from fields. The silence is not oppressive but natural, broken by the rhythms of work and rest. The city may be gone, but life has continued, reshaped into smaller circles. Another fact steadies you. Medieval Europe's survival depended on these rural communities. While cities shrank, farms kept people alive, producing grain, wool, and milk. Without them, the silence would have been total. Instead, it became patchwork, empty forums but busy farmyards, abandoned amphitheatres but crowded barns. You lean against a broken wall, gazing at the stars. For peasants, those same stars guided planting seasons, told time, and offered comfort. You imagine a farmer pointing at Orion's belt, telling his child, "That's the plough in the sky." The silence here is shared between earth and heavens, practical and poetic at once. A quirky smile comes to you. Peasants sometimes believed Roman ruins were built by giants. Imagine sitting by a fire telling your kids, "See those massive stones? Only giants could have lifted them." The children shiver, wide-eyed, while outside, goats chew happily on weeds growing between those same stones. You walk slowly through the fields, your steps brushing tall grass. The silence here is companionable. It doesn't grieve for lost empire or mourn fallen cities. It simply accepts, grows, and feeds. You realize the peasant's silence is not the end of Rome, it's the seedbed of something else. Historians still argue whether this seedbed was the beginning of medieval Europe, the birth of new cultures rooted in soil instead of stone. You nod softly. The silence of peasants is not glamorous, but it is enduring. It is the silence of resilience, of humans choosing life over monuments. You turn back toward the city. Its ruins loom in the distance, but the fields feel more alive. You smile faintly, realizing that while Rome's grandeur fell into silence, its people found a quieter way to endure, and perhaps in the long run, that was the truest survival. You leave the patchwork farms behind, their smoke and goats fading into the night, and make your way toward higher ground. The silence shifts again, becoming less about humble survival and more about dominance. On a ridge above the city ruins stands a silhouette, thick walls, narrow windows, a squat tower stabbing at the sky. A medieval castle, or at least the beginnings of one, built from the very stones stripped out of Roman villas and temples. You climb slowly toward it, hearing only the crunch of gravel underfoot, and realize this is where power relocated when Rome's cities collapsed, not in forum, but in fortresses. The castle looms above you, its outline jagged against the stars. Its gates are shut, its torches long gone, but you can picture the bustle it once contained. Horses snorting in the courtyard, blacksmiths hammering iron, servants scurrying with baskets. The silence here is guarded, defensive, as though the walls themselves are still braced for attack. A mainstream historical fact anchors this shift. After the empire's fall, local lords and warlords filled the power vacuum. Fortified manors and castles became the centers of authority, offering protection in exchange for loyalty or labor. Cities, once hubs of governance, shrank into shadows, while castles rose as islands of control in seas of chaos. A quirky tidbit adds color. Some early castles incorporated actual Roman amphitheaters or forums into their designs. In one case, peasants built their huts inside the walls of an old colosseum, turning a theater of blood into a neighborhood block. Imagine cooking stew in the shadow of the same arches where gladiators once fought. You grin softly, the absurdity both comic and strangely fitting. Historians still argue whether the rise of castles preserved remnants of civilization or accelerated urban decline. Did castles protect survivors, giving them stability, or did they siphon energy away from reviving cities, cementing the shift toward rural feudalism? The silence here refuses to answer, though the thick walls seem to lean toward power over community. You step carefully through a ruined outer wall, stones uneven, grass sprouting in the cracks. Inside, the castle's courtyard yawns open, empty except for rubble. But in your imagination, it is alive. Knights polish armor, dogs bark, women spin wool while gossiping about the lord's latest feud. A boy runs past with a wooden sword, shouting triumphantly as if already a conqueror. The sensory picture grows sharper. You smell smoke from the forge, hear the clang of hammer on anvil, taste the metallic tang of heated iron. You picture guards patrolling the walls, their eyes scanning the horizon for raiders. The city below is silent, but here the fortress hums with life. A playful thought intrudes. If castles had had Wi-Fi, they would have advertised themselves as secure networks with excellent firewall protection. You chuckle at your own joke, your laugh swallowed by the shadowy walls. Another fact grounds you. Castles weren't just military, they were administrative. Lords collected taxes here, judged disputes, and organized defenses. The castle was the replacement for the forum, the bathhouse, even the amphitheatre. It wasn't about shared civic life, it was about command. People didn't gather for debate. They came for orders, for protection, or to pay dues. You wander into the great hall, its roof long since collapsed. Moonlight spills across broken flagstones. You picture feasts here, the lord at the head table, minstrels singing, dogs lurking underfoot for scraps. Servants rush about with trenchers of bread and meat. The hall roars with laughter and arguments, firelight dancing on stone walls. Tonight the silence is thick and cool, the hearth long cold. Another quirky tidbit: medieval lords often had jesters to liven their feasts. Imagine a jester performing in this hall, juggling apples stolen from the lord's kitchen while knights tried to keep straight faces. Even in the most fortified spaces, laughter found its way in. Historians still argue whether castles were symbols of security or oppression. Did peasants look at them with relief, safe within their shadow, or with resentment, seeing only the lord's dominance? You lean against a broken pillar, considering. Silence here doesn't feel safe. It feels controlled, as though voices never truly belong to the people, only borrowed it's the whim of those in power. You climb a spiral stair, the steps chipped and uneven. At the top, the view spreads wide. Below, the city lies dark, its ruins stretched out like bones. Beyond, farmlands patch the hills, their smoke faint in the moonlight. And here, the castle sits alone, watching, commanding. The silence feels absolute, an island of authority above a sea of absence. A playful image sneaks in. Imagine a Roman senator seeing this transformation. He frowns at the crude stonework, the lack of marble columns, and mutters, "This isn't architecture, this is panic with a roof." You smile softly, agreeing with him just a little. Another fact steadies your thoughts. Many castles used spolia, stones taken directly from Roman buildings. Columns became door frames, statues became walls, inscriptions were carved into rubble. The empire's grandeur was literally built into feudal authority, its voice silenced, but its body recycled. You descend into the courtyard again, pausing by a dry well. You peer into its dark mouth and imagine servants once drawing water, gossiping while the bucket creaked upward. The well is empty now, echoing only silence. You realize that silence in castles is not gentle. It is a silence of dominance, of guardedness, of exclusion. Another quirky tidbit. Some lords kept exotic pets as symbols of status, including bears. Picture a bear chained in this courtyard, peasants gawking, knights nervously laughing. The silence now seems to snort in amusement at the memory. You stroll toward the gatehouse. The heavy doors are gone, but the arch remains. You picture guards standing here, demanding tolls, sneering at peasants, saluting the lord. Power passed through this arch like grain through a funnel. Tonight, your passage is free, the silence not charging you anything but reflection. Historians still argue whether the rise of castles was the end of Rome or the beginning of summits. Hing knew. Did they choke urban life or keep its embers alive? You sigh softly because the silence doesn't care about arguments. It simply reminds you that power never really vanishes. it only changes address. As you step outside the walls, the night air feels wider again. The castle behind you looms like a dark sentinel, its silence not mournful but commanding, reminding you that when cities sleep, lords in stone towers dream of ruling what remains. You descend the hill slowly, the silence following you like a cloak, heavy but steady. The peasants' fields wait below, the city's ruins stretch beyond, and above it all the castle stands watch. The voice of Rome is gone, but the silence of lords has taken its place, quiet, guarded, and enduring. You descend from the looming castle into a valley where ivy drapes itself like heavy curtains across broken arches. The ruins here feel different from the civic silence of forums or the guarded silence of fortresses. This silence carries stories, not facts, not records, but whispers of imagination. You've stepped into the world where myths about ruins sprouted, where travellers, peasants, and wandering monks peered at crumbling columns and invented tales of ghosts, giants, and gods refusing to die. You pause by a toppled statue lying on its side, its face smoothed by rain. To you, it's a relic of empire, but imagine a medieval shepherd stumbling across it centuries ago. He doesn't see Jupiter Optimus Maximus, Lord of the Sky. He sees a stone giant, frozen mid-thought, cursed for pride. He hurries home and tells his children, "Beware the sleeping stone men, they might wake." The silence of the ruins becomes a stage for imagination. A mainstream historical fact steadies your step. During the Middle Ages, classical ruins often inspired fear or awe. With little understanding of Rome's true past, people created legends. The Colosseum was said to be a beehive of demons. Roman bridges were credited to the devil himself, their engineering too marvelous to be human. Instead of civic memory, ruins carried supernatural reputations. Here's the quirky tidbit. One medieval traveller claimed that strange lights danced around the ruins at night. Today we'd blame fireflies or swamp gas, but back then it became a story of restless spirits. Imagine villagers huddled by a fire, whispering about glowing ghosts wandering the forum. You grin, amused at how imagination thrives where knowledge fades. Historians still argue whether these myths preserved fragments of Roman memory or erased them entirely. Were ruins seen as warnings of fallen pride, or as magical relics hinting at ancient Greece, at Ness? The silence doesn't answer, though it certainly invites the stories. You step under a vine-draped arch. The moonlight filters through leaves, casting strange, shifting shadows. For a moment you understand how ruins sparked tales. The arches look like open jaws, the columns like guardians, the silence like breath held in anticipation. If you didn't know history, you too might whisper, "Something still lives here." The sensory imagination sharpens. You hear villagers telling tales of giants who built these stones, of buried treasure guarded by serpents, of voices that echo at midnight if you dare to call. The ruins are no longer just abandoned, they're alive in stories, wrapped in folklore. A playful thought intrudes. Imagine medieval kids daring each other to run through the ruins at night, like the original version of a haunted house challenge. One trips over a fallen column, screams, and suddenly the whole gang believes they've seen a ghost. You chuckle softly, the sound swallowed by ivy and stone. Another fact grounds your reflection. Ruins often became pilgrimage sites, not for history but for miracles. Some believed saints had sanctified them, others thought demons dwelled within. Even poets like Petrarch centuries later described ruins as half alive, breathing memory into the present. You pause at a wall where carvings remain faintly visible, Latin inscriptions barely legible. A medieval peasant likely couldn't read them but might trace the letters with trembling fingers, imagining spells or secret codes. Illiteracy gave silence new voices. The written word turned into mystery, the silence into enchantment. Another quirky tidbit. In some places, peasants believed Roman ruins were entrances to fairy realms. Imagine slipping into a crumbled villa, convinced you'd stumble into a banquet of otherworldly beings. Perhaps that's how ghost stories kept children from wandering too far. Historians still argue whether these myths harmed or preserved knowledge of Rome. Did they distort memory beyond recognition or keep ruins relevant by cloaking them in magic? You smile, realizing both may be true. Silence never stays empty. It always gets filled, even if by stories of demons or fairies. You walk into what must have been a basilica, its roof gone, ivy spilling down the walls. The silence here is almost theatrical. You imagine a traveller pausing here alone in the dark, telling himself stories to ease his fear. These stones are cursed. No, blessed, no, both. The mind invents what silence refuses to explain. Another playful thought. Imagine a medieval farmer explaining ruins to his curious child. Giants built it, then angels cursed it, then the devil borrowed it for a party. The child nods solemnly, satisfied. History solved. You step through a doorway into the open air. The stars above seem sharper, framed by arches. The ruins hum softly in your imagination, not with voices of the past, but with tales layered over centuries. Each vine, each crack, each echo became fodder for stories. Another fact anchors your wandering. Medieval texts sometimes described Rome as a city of ghosts, where emperors still walked at night. Pilgrims wrote of hearing phantom parades. Ruins weren't dead, they were haunted, alive in imagination. The silence grows heavier, but not oppressive. It feels like a theatre after the audience left, the stage still humming with the memory of performance. You walk slowly, your steps careful as though not to wake something. Another quirky tidbit, some ruins becare. Quarry pits for treasure hunters. People believed golden statues or hidden vaults lay buried under collapsed temples. More often than not, they found nothing but snakes and mouldy bricks. But hope thrives in silence too. You lean against a cracked column, feeling its roughness under your palm. In your imagination, peasants circle around at night, torches flickering, telling ghost stories. Their voices rise, then fall, then hush. The ruins swallow their words, leaving silence again. Historians still argue how much of Rome's image survived through myth. Was the grandeur preserved in distorted echoes, or did stories erase reality entirely? You sigh softly. The silence around you doesn't choose. It welcomes both memory and invention. A playful joke eases the heaviness. If ruins had Yelp reviews back then, they'd read, "Creepy atmosphere, haunted by demons, but great place to scare kids. 3-5 stars." You leave the ivy-draped arches behind, the silence following you like a cloak of old stories. The ruins do not resist the myths, they embrace them. In their silence they remain alive, not as they were, but as people imagined them. As you step into the wider street, the night feels thicker. You carry with you the realization that myths are how humans converse with silence. Rome may have fallen, but in the hush of its ruins, it was reborn as legend. You leave behind the ivy-choked ruins that whispered of giants and demons, and your path bends toward a cluster of smaller stone buildings on the city's edge. The silence here is unlike any you've heard before. It's not fearful like plague, nor practical like peasants' farms, nor commanding like castles. It is disciplined, patient, almost rhythmic, as though each breath you take joins a centuries-old chant. You have arrived where knowledge did not vanish entirely, but was cradled in fragile hands, the monasteries where scholars worked by candlelight to keep fragments of Rome alive. You pause at the wooden gate of a ruined cloister. The hinges are rusted, the planks splintered, but you imagine it centuries earlier, monks rising before dawn, pulling hoods over their heads, shuffling silently into the chapel to chant. Their Latin, though rustic and strange, carried the echo of Cicero and Virgil, even if unintentionally. In a world where cities emptied and ruins turned to barns, here words still survived. A mainstream historical fact anchors this scene. During the early Middle Ages, monasteries became centers of learning. Monks copied manuscripts by hand, preserving not only biblical texts, but also Roman works of philosophy, law, and literature. Without them, vast portions of Rome's memory would have vanished. The silence of the cities found a counterpoint in the scratching of pens on parchment. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some manuscripts contain doodles monks added in the margins. Cats chasing mice, bored faces, even complaints like, "My hand is tired." Imagine preserving Aristotle while grumbling, "This pen is awful." You smile, the thought making the silence less severe, more human. Historians still argue whether monks preserved knowledge for posterity or simply by accident. Did they consciously safeguard Rome's legacy, or were they just copying whatever was available while waiting for supper bells? The silence of these cloisters doesn't clarify. It only hums, steady and calm, like the rhythm of chanting monks. You step inside the cloister. The central courtyard is overgrown with weeds, but you imagine neat rows of herbs once cultivated here: sage, rosemary, mint, both for healing and for flavouring the meagre meals of the brethren. The silence smells of earth and memory. You walk along the covered walkway, the stone cool under your fingers, and imagine the shuffle of sandals, the whispered prayers, the sigh of parchment drying. The sensory picture sharpens. You hear the faint scratch of a quill on vellum, the drip of wax from a candle, the rustle of robes as a monk shifts in his chair. Hours would pass in silence, broken only by the occasional cough or murmur of Latin. Outside, empires crumbled, but inside, letters marched carefully across pages, one after another. A playful thought intrudes. Imagine a monk complaining about writer's cramp. "Brother Marcus, I can't finish copying Cicero. My wrist hurts." The abbot sighs. "Offer it up as penance, brother." You chuckle softly, the laugh swallowed by the cloister's stillness. Another fact steadies your reflection. Monasteries weren't just libraries. They were lifelines. They taught basic reading, kept records of land and harvest, and offered shelter to travellers. In a world where roads broke and cities emptied, the cloister walls gathered people into a small circle of stability. You wander into the scriptorium, or what's left of it. A collapsed roof lets moonlight pour onto a stone desk. You picture monks bent over manuscripts, their quills dipping into ink made from soot or oak galls. They copied not only scripture, but medical treatises, histories, even poetry. Some made errors, some improved phrasing, some added comments. The silence here feels industrious, purposeful. Another quirky tidbit. One manuscript margin has a monk noting, "The weather is bad, the wine is sour, and the scribe is miserable." You grin, realizing that even in silence, humor refused to die. Historians still argue how much Roman culture truly survived in monasteries. Were monks guardians of empire, or midwives to a new world that only borrowed fragments? Did they preserve Rome faithfully or reshape it into something medieval? You lean against the broken wall, letting the silence answer only with patience. You move into the chapel. The altar is cracked, but you imagine candles flickering, casting halos of gold against stone. The chant of monks fills your ears in memory, slow, resonant, repetitive. It is both prayer and meditation, a way to fill silence with rhythm. Where forums once rang with debate, cloisters filled the void with hymn. A playful image sneaks in. Imagine a monk half asleep during chant, nodding off mid-psalm, startling awake only when his neighbour elbows him. Some things about group gatherings never change. Another fact grounds you. Illuminated manuscripts, texts decorated with gold leaf and vivid colours came out of these monasteries. Imagine a monk painting delicate vines and bright birds in the margin of Augustine's sermons, the page glowing under lamplight. Beauty survived even in silence. You step outside into the courtyard again. The night air is cool, the silence deep. You imagine monks moving quietly, speaking only when necessary, living by a rhythm of prayer, work, and study. The grandeur of cities was gone, but in these small communities, time itself slowed, giving memory space to breathe. Another quirky tidbit: some monasteries brewed beer, both for sustenance and for sale. Imagine copying Cicero all morning, then rewarding yourself with a pint of ale at lunch. You laugh softly, realizing scholarship and comfort often went hand in hand. Historians still argue whether monasteries truly saved civilization or simply carried fragments until cities revived centuries later. You decide it doesn't matter. The silence here doesn't feel like decay. It feels like safekeeping, like whispers held in cupped hands until the world was ready again. You pause at the gate, looking back one last time. The cloister is still, its silence calm, its memory intact. In the ruins of Rome, cities died, but in the hush of monasteries, voices were preserved, faint but steady. As you step back into the moonlit road, the silence follows you, not empty, not fearful, but patient. It hums like a chant in your chest, reminding you that even in abandonment, memory can be kept alive by quiet hands waiting for centuries to pass before speaking again. You walk away from the cloister's steady silence, the faint echo of chants still vibrating in your imagination, and find yourself on a road leading into the last flickering edges of empire. The night deepens, the stars shimmer harder, and the ruins around you feel thinner, less like places and more like fading memories. Here, parchment once crackled with decrees, seals stamped with authority, officials rushing to enforce laws. Now the silence hangs heavy where the empire's last words dissolved into nothing. You've entered the twilight of Roman rule, where the final officials vanished, their voices trailing off into unread scrolls. You pause before a cracked building that looks like it might once have been an office. Nothing grand, just practical stone. You imagine scribes hunched over desks, copying decrees in careful Latin. Their quills scratch furiously, sealing wax drips, and runners dart off with rolled-up scrolls. Collect taxes, repair roads, enforce law. These were the rhythms of empire. Tonight, the desks are shattered, the scrolls eaten by mold, and the silence has more authority than any official decree ever did. A mainstream historical fact grounds the picture. By the 5th century, Western Rome's bureaucracy had collapsed. Governors no longer collected taxes consistently, city councils dissolved, and imperial edicts went ignored. Local lords, bishops, or warlords took charge instead. The parchment decrees still existed, but they had no teeth. Cities that once lived by orders from Rome learned to live without them. Here's the quirky tidbit. One late Roman law complained that people were ignoring laws by pretending they hadn't heard them. Imagine shrugging at a tax collector and saying, "Oh, sorry, didn't hear about that decree," and then walking away. Bureaucratic ghosting, the oldest trick in the book. You grin softly, the laugh swallowed by the ruins. Historians still argue whether the collapse of bureaucracy caused cities to die, or whether emptying cities simply made bureaucracy irrelevant. Was the silence of government the first domino to fall or the last? The silence around you refuses to decide. It only hangs, thick and still. You step into the shadow of a toppled column. In your imagination, an official once stood here, reading out loud from a decree, by order of the Emperor. His voice rang across the forum, citizens muttered or cheered, and scribes scribbled notes. Now you hear only the chirp of crickets, the soft shuffle of your own sandals. The authority once etched into every syllable is gone, replaced by a silence that rules without effort. The sensory picture sharpens. You picture the clatter of wax tablets opening, the murmur of debates, the slam of a fist on a desk as one official argued with another. Papers stacked high, ink-stained hands, voices raised until the room buzzed like a hive. And then, one day, silence. The hive emptied, the bees gone. A playful thought intrudes. Imagine the last Roman official storming out of his office. Fine, if nobody listens. Ends, I quit. He slams the door, mutters about moving to the countryside, and Rome never files paperwork again. You chuckle, amused by the idea of civilization undone by bureaucratic burnout. Another fact steadies you. After the empire's western fall in 476 CE, Roman administrative titles sometimes continued in name. A few barbarian kings even called themselves consuls, or adopted Roman customs to appear legitimate. But these were costumes on corpses. The real machinery was gone, its silence louder than its words. You wander into a chamber where the floor is littered with rubble. Perhaps it was once a record hall. You picture scrolls piled high in niches, the smell of papyrus, the rustle of parchment. Now you see only broken stone and weeds. The silence here feels heavy with lost records, tax lists, laws, even letters from citizens. Without them, lives vanished into anonymity. The silence is erasure. Another quirky tidbit. In some abandoned offices, archaeologists found tablets reused for grocery lists. Imagine the empire's final paperwork devolving into buy bread, figs, oil. You smile, shaking your head. Even bureaucracy has to eat. Historians still argue whether the empire's collapse was sudden or gradual. Did it fall with a crash in 476 when Romulus Augustulus was deposed, or had it been dying quietly for centuries? Was silence sudden or a slow dimming? You shrug, because standing here it feels like both. Some doors slammed shut, others just creaked open and never closed again. You walk into the open night again, the stars bright above. You picture a messenger once galloping down this road with a decree tied to his saddle, heart pounding, the weight of empire in his pouch. He would have reached a city square, unfurled the scroll, read aloud, and watched faces react. That messenger is long gone. The decree never mattered. The silence is the only proclamate. Ion that endures. A light joke surfaces. If Romans had email, maybe the empire would have lasted longer, or maybe everyone would have just ignored the messages in their inbox anyway. Unread decrees, 5,000. The sensory silence deepens. You feel the absence of voices that once commanded armies, funded aqueducts, and dictated laws. Without them, cities didn't just lose power, they lost identity. A city without orders is a body without nerves, twitching without direction. Silence becomes both disease and cure. Another fact grounds you. While the West collapsed, the Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople continued for centuries, preserving much of Rome's administrative culture. But here, in the abandoned Western cities, silence replaced officials. Decrees went unspoken, laws unenforced, paperwork rotted. In Constantinople, the empire lived. Here it slept. Another quirky tidbit. One medieval chronicler joked that Rome fell because no one could afford the ink anymore. Of course it wasn't literal, but it captures the truth. When writing loses authority, silence wins. You pause at the edge of the ruins, looking back at the skeletal buildings. You realize the silence of bureaucracy is unique. It isn't dramatic like amphitheatres or sacred like chapels. It's a silence of paper never read, of orders never obeyed. It's the silence of authority dissolved into thin air. You stand still, breathing deeply, letting the quiet settle over you. It feels final, like the empire's last whisper has already faded. Yet it also feels freeing, as though silence itself declared independence from decrees. As you step forward, you carry with you the realization that Rome's voice ended not with one cry but with many tiny silences. The silence of offices, of scribes, of messengers who stopped writing. In the end, parchment didn't burn, it just stopped mattering, and the quiet that followed was louder than any decade. You wander away from the abandoned offices where parchment once pretended to matter and drift slowly into the heart of the ruins. The night feels deeper now, softer, as though the city itself is drawing a final breath. Broken streets stretch ahead, their stones glowing faintly in the moonlight. Columns lean like weary old men, villas slump in half-remembered grandeur, and arches crumble into ivy. Everywhere you turn, silence pools. This is the silence not of one building or one function, but of the city as a whole. You have entered the place where Roman cities no longer struggled, no longer debated, no longer fought. They simply slept. You stop in the middle of an open square. Once it might have been a bustling crossroad, full of carts creaking and vendors shouting. Now it feels like a stage after the audience has left, the props still scattered, the spotlight turned off. You tilt your head, listening. There is no roar of amphitheatres, no chants of prayer, no quills scratching parchment, no water rushing through aqueducts, only crickets and the slow hum of night air. The city has drifted into a long slumber. A mainstream historical fact anchors your reflection. By the early Middle Ages, many Roman cities had shrunk into small fortified towns or had been abandoned altogether. Populations that once numbered in tens of thousands dwindled to a few hundred. Markets collapsed, civic institutions vanished, and monumental architecture stood empty. Where Rome once bragged of urban superiority, Europe became a landscape of villages and castles. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some travellers in the medieval period described wandering through ruins where cows grazed inside former basilicas. Imagine animals chewing grass where senators once debated policy. The silence of Rome wasn't empty, it was punctuated by the lowing of cattle. You smile faintly, realizing history never loses its sense of irony. Historians still argue whether this final silence should be called collapse or transformation. Were Roman cities truly dead, or had they simply shifted into new forms of life? Fortified hamlets, monasteries, castles. Was this the end of an era, or the awkward adolescence of a new one? The silence here doesn't care. It simply holds everything in stillness, waiting. You walk toward a ruined fountain in the square. Its basin is cracked, its statues faceless, but you imagine water once tumbling here, cool and clear. Children laughed, women filled jars, old men argued over politics. Now dust fills the basin. You crouch and press your hand to the stone, cold and dry. The silence feels absolute. The sensory picture sharpens. You hear the imagined hush of footsteps echoing faintly down empty streets, the sigh of wind through arches, the whisper of leaves brushing against marble. The city sleeps with the patience of centuries. Its silence is not fearful anymore. It is restful. A playful thought intrudes. Imagine someone waking the city like a cranky sleeper. Rise and shine, Rome. The ruins groan, roll over and mutter, 5 more centuries, please. You chuckle softly, the sound carried away on the breeze. Another fact steadies your thought. Many medieval people viewed Roman ruins not with nostalgia, but with bewilderment. To them, these structures were relics of a world too strange to comprehend. The silence wasn't mourned, it was simply accepted, folded into the rhythm of a new world. You wander into a side street lined with collapsed houses. You picture shutters banging softly in the wind, weeds climbing through cracks, doorways yawning open like mouths frozen mid-sentence. In your imagination, families once hurried here, carrying baskets, arguing about chores, whispering gossip. Now their voices are gone, leaving only the echo of your footsteps. Another quirky tidbit: some legends claimed Roman ruins were cursed and that sleeping inside them brought bad dreams or death. Imagine medieval wanderers avoiding entire quarters at night, convinced the silence itself was dangerous. The ruins weren't just quiet, they were alive in eerie ways. Historians still argue whether cities like this truly died or were simply reborn smaller, humbler, rural in character. You stand still, realizing that for those who lived here, the difference didn't matter. The silence of grandeur had simply given way to the murmur of survival. You climb a half-collapsed staircase, emerging onto a rooftop. From here, the ruins stretch in every direction. The city sprawled like a sleeping giant under the stars. The amphitheater's curve glows faintly in moonlight. The broken aqueduct arches line the horizon. The castle crouches on its hill. And all of it, every villa, every forum, every shrine, is silent. It is not frightening now. It is serene. You let your breath slow, matching the city's slumber. The silence feels like a lullaby, the ruins like a cradle holding centuries of memory. Rome hasn't disappeared, it has simply gone to sleep, waiting for new voices to rise when the world is ready. A playful image sneaks in. Imagine the ruins talking in their sleep. Did I build that road? Did I forget to pay the legions? You laugh gently, the sound soft, as though you too are afraid to wake the dreamer. Another fact steadies you. By the Renaissance, these ruins would inspire awe again. Artists, scholars, and poets would wander through them, sketching columns, copying inscriptions, dreaming of reviving Rome's glory. The silence would end not with a roar, but with whispers of curiosity, of rediscovery. You stand quietly, letting this thought settle. Tonight the silence is perfect, but it is not forever. It is simply the pause between movements in a symphony, the breath before the next note. You descend from the rooftop, your steps slow, and make your way back to the square. The fountain waits, cracked but dignified, a fitting heart for a city asleep. You sit on its edge, folding your hands in your lap, breathing in the silence. It feels less like loss now and more like peace. Another quirky tidbit: travellers in later centuries sometimes carved their names into ruins as though scratching graffiti into Rome's silence would make them immortal. "I was here," they wrote, not realizing the city itself was saying the same thing in stone. You lean back, gazing at the stars. They shine steadily, just as they did when Rome rose and fell. The silence of the city blends with the silence of the cosmos, and you realize it is all one lullaby, ancient and endless. The night deepens. The ruins fade into shadow. And you, sitting quietly, let the silence wash over you until you too feel drowsy, as though the city's slumber has pulled you into its dream. The silence now softens, stretching like a blanket across both ruins and listener. The sharp edges of broken stone blur in your imagination, smoothed by the glow of moonlight. Each breath comes slower, each thought quieter, as though the city itself is rocking you gently to sleep. You picture the roads you walked tonight, straight Roman highways now fading into grass, forums where voices once tangled but now lie still, aqueducts stretching like ribs across valleys, baths gone cold, chapels glowing faintly, amphitheatres sighing with shadows. All of them drift together in your memory, dissolving into a calm haze. Nothing presses urgently anymore, nothing demands an answer. Even the historians who argued about causes and meaning seem distant now, their debates hushed by the weight of centuries. The ruins themselves whisper reassurance. Yes, everything crumbles, but everything also rests. The stones are not angry, the silence not accusing. They are simply sleeping, like a tired traveller after a long road, and you, too, are welcome to sleep beside them. Your breathing deepens, the rhythm of your heart slows, the night air cools the last tension from your shoulders. The stars above flicker not with urgency, but with steady calm, like lanterns left burning in a hallway to guide you safely into dreams. The ruins fade from your imagination now, dissolving into darkness. You are no longer walking ancient streets, you are floating, drifting, safe. The silence that once felt eerie now feels like a lullaby, timeless and protective. So let go, let the city sleep, let history rest, let your own thoughts unwind into the hush. The stones will keep watch. The silence will hold you, and when your eyes close fully, the dream will be gentle.